Hey guys. Yurizy here. This is part 2 of What If Sakura Became Independent. Hit like and subscribe, and also don't forget to check the author. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 8, Catapedophobia. When they returned to Tezuna's home, they found Naruto waiting for them, or rather, for Sakura, like an eager puppy. His eyes were shining and his expression was animated as he danced from foot to foot. Tezuna said that the two of you hijacked Gato's yacht. He exclaimed almost the instant they'd come in the door, Sakura still in the process of very delicately trying to remove her sandals. If she'd been less used to Naruto, she might have lost her balance, but she was both tired and growing accustomed to his antics. So instead she only stared at him for a long moment before she slipped the sandal the rest of the way off, aligning them neatly in the jinken. I mean, me and Sasuke were busy with Haku, and there was a noticeable dip in his enthusiasm there that she found strange, so I didn't see. But Tezuna said when you saw that crowd of mercenaries you used some sort of awesome jutsu on them that made them freeze up, then, whoosh, you just took off running. Threw him over your shoulder and jumped off the bridge. He was bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet by this point, while Sakura was trying hard not to relive those moments when she'd had just enough time while flying to decide how much falling was going to hurt. He swept his hand through the air in sharp diagonal gesture, really into his storytelling by this point. And then you charge down this beam and leap from it onto the deck of the yacht, where you and Tezuna take on 3 goons before sailing off in triumph. It was a lot more heroic sounding when Naruto told it than the actual event. The implicit praise left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she still felt a little residual guilt for trying to hit him earlier in the day. So she only shifted so that one hand clutched at her other arm, which had the advantage of controlling the fine trembling of her hands. It's not, you or Sasuke-kun wouldn't have had any trouble. And that, she realized with a strange sense of almost alienation from her body, was very close to the truth. Maybe the leap from the bridge and then from the beam to the yacht wouldn't have gone as well for either of them. That was chakra manipulation and mathematics. But if they'd gotten to the yacht, it would have gone very differently. In her mind, she could still see Sasuke-kun cutting down Zabuza's water clones, quick and breathtaking as a flash of lightning. Naruto, less skilled, but more tenacious, with dozens of shadow clones at his command that could be cut down without ever leaving scars. Just as in that moment when Kakashi-sensei had prompted her into a realization of the team's specialization, she was struck with the feeling that she didn't belong. She'd fought men who were thugs, who might not even have been missing Nin, and she was left with flashbacks and nightmares and scars. Sasuke-kun and Naruto had faced down real missing Nin without displaying even a fraction of her clumsy desperation. They'd wanted to win a fight. Sakura had just been determined not to die. She had a sudden, unsettling premonition of her future, Kakashi-sensei's words from that night searing across her mind. Surviving brought more battles and more difficult ones. Because they wouldn't be genin forever. One day, they would be sent on missions like these as a matter of course, not just because of a less than truthful commission. Sakura-chan? Naruto asked her with concern, making her realize she'd gone silent and still. Sasuke-kun was looking at her as well. Habit was a powerful thing, even in the face of world-shaking events. An instant, false smile replaced her slack expression. Sorry, I'm a little tired. With a spluttered apology, Naruto scrambled back out of the way and let her come inside the house. But at that moment, not even the prospect of being confined to the house with Sasuke-kun could brighten her spirits. Because she was starting to understand that this wasn't some sort of horrific training exercise where she could close her eyes and wait for it to all be over. It was her life. And like it or not, she had to live it. That was what surviving meant. That night, it wasn't only her nightmares that woke her. She'd wondered blearily why she was awake, because there weren't any of those clinging remnants of terror, when the soft noises she heard resolved themselves into something more like speech, though it was too low for her to make out individual words. But from the footfalls, it was Naruto that Kakashi-sensei ushered outside. And when she turned over to make herself more comfortable, she found herself catching Sasuke-kun's gaze before he rolled over and stoically pretended sleep. Kakashi-sensei opted to stay in the land of waves until construction of the bridge was finished, something that was greatly helped along by the fact that the government of the land of waves had seized Gato's assets. Despite all his efforts to assure it was never completed, Gato's ill-gotten gains were going to pay for the construction of the bridge. The only disappointment was that they wouldn't be able to keep all of it. They would eventually have to return at least part of the funds that belonged to his legitimate corporation, but they were spitefully drawing out the bureaucratic process. Though Gato himself had died on the bridge at Zabuza's hand, he'd brought in a lot of mercenaries who had grown used to the easy pickings and who hadn't been at that battle. They were being slowly transferred to the mainland, but Team 7 was still serving guard duty on a rotational basis. Kakashi-sensei took the afternoon shift, which Sakura joined him on when he pronounced her fit enough for light duty, after 2 days of miserable fever, which had left her totally unable to enjoy her time with Sasuke-kun, and they generally relieved Sasuke-kun and Naruto at whatever point Kakashi-sensei pronounced was midday. But afternoon was actually the relaxing part of the day, because while he set Sasuke-kun and Naruto on their way with instructions to spar, the results of which he evaluated when they returned to Zuna home at the end of the day, her mornings were graced with Kakashi-sensei's partial attention. Which, for someone who never experienced much of it, turned out to be plenty. What Sasuke needs most is practice, and Naruto learns best by repetition, he told her as they faced each other in a grassy meadow not far from Tizuna's house. It was not long before dawn, and the world was cast in gray light that was less ominous than the last time they'd had a talk like this, though it helped that Kakashi-sensei was far less intense this time as well. Pairing them makes good sense for both their learning styles. You, on the other hand, are a genjutsu type, which comes hand in hand with a high intelligence. And you can't come within 20 feet of the academy as a potential Jounin sensei without hearing the instructors complain about how hard it is to get genjutsu types engaged in class exercises. Your learning style is just different. Ninjutsu and taijutsu types learn best with their bodies, but that busy little brain of yours makes your attention wander if it isn't suitably occupied. Give you a diagram and a demonstration and you learn things easily. So during basic drills you tend to pay more attention to that cute shinobi in the second row than your forms. And worst of all, you're smart enough to figure out the least amount of effort you can put into anything and still be praised for it. Sakura blushed at the accuracy of that assessment. Drill, when they weren't doing new maneuvers or anything particularly difficult, had been something she'd done with minimal effort and concentration. And she had spent a lot of time eyeing Sasuke-kun during it. But then Kakashi-sensei was speaking again, and unlike her exercises in the academy, she gave him her full attention. I don't want you to take away from this that drill is unimportant. Because it is. Building muscle memory can save your life in combat situations. But it's a poor fit for you, so we're going to try things a little differently in your training. And now that we have some Sensei and Sakura time, we can continue where we left off. Movement. Just movement? Sakura asked hesitantly. Your taijutsu style is textbook academy standard, Kakashi-sensei replied flatly. Frankly speaking, it's like off-the-rack clothing. Because it's been designed to fit everyone, it doesn't fit anyone well, though it'd be just fine if you weren't in a combat squad. And if you were male, it might work regardless if we put enough effort into it. But your strength isn't ever going to be in height, reach, or weight. Your advantage is going to be in chakra manipulation, so it's a little bit pointless to teach you anything new until we find your limits there. Then he smiled, glancing over at her. Also, I think it's a little bit early in the healing process to think about any intense taijutsu training. Sakura allowed herself a cautious sigh of relief at that, but then another thought occurred to her. And genjutsu? She prodded. Kakashi-sensei made a thoughtful-sounding hum. I'll make you a deal, Sakura-chan. If you have enough energy left to have trouble sleeping at night, I'll teach you a genjutsu. But, he said, holding up a finger, only one per week. The rest of the time, you can distract yourself by considering how they might be applied in the field. Knowing one jutsu and knowing how and when to use it is more valuable than 10 you don't. She nodded and her eyes fell to the large sack at Kakashi-sensei's side. What's that, sensei? Training tools. But before we get to them, Let's see if we can't teach you how to jump from high places without doing any permanent damage to your joints. Any? It's sort of a pity that we're out of the village. I think you're one of the few who would actually benefit from some of the reference texts. But no help for that. I'll just explain as we go along. Unlike her teachers at the academy, Kakashi-sensei wasn't quick to praise her. Though it wasn't that he was quick to scold or correct either. It was mostly that he would explain briefly what he wanted her to do, demonstrate it once, and then leave her to untangle the particulars on her own while he napped nearby. It was the least guided set of guided exercises she'd ever participated in. At first she was resentful of this approach, until success taught her that the overly detailed lectures of her former teachers were a crutch she didn't need. And some part of her acknowledged, given how he'd collapsed before and how often he was awake in the night with his students, maybe the extra sleep was a good idea if things went sour. She found quickly that working through each chakra manipulation on her own was far more rewarding than being hand-fed every single thing, which had been an enormous source of her frustration with Naruto in the academy. She'd always mastered things like this quickly, which made it irritating to have to wait for the teachers to coach the slowest students through the exercises over and over. Her patience would quickly be spent and her mind would wander to other, more appealing things, like how perfect Sasuke-kun's profile was. Not here. As soon as she'd suitably mastered one thing, Kakashi-sensei foisted another on her. Having mastered leaping from limb to limb very quickly, she moved on to leaping from heights with more caution. Her recent experience was riding her heavily, and her slightly cautious approach to learning physical things made her work her way up to more extreme heights gradually. But as the heights increased, she grew more uneasy, making simple mistakes that made her land harder or more awkwardly than she should have. She lost confidence with each of them, and a sick feeling grew in her stomach. After one particularly bad landing, she crouched down and wrapped her arms around her legs, cradling her chin on her knees. This isn't working, she thought to herself. Soon she'd really screw it up, get herself hurt again, and then where would she be? But she was already taking all the precautions she could think of and working under the most controlled conditions she could manage. And still she was afraid, and a part of her mind, a very small part, separate from that fear, knew it was the reason she kept faltering. Closing her eyes, she tried to imagine what Kakashi-sensei might do to help her. And then sighed because help and Kakashi-sensei still sounded a lot like antonyms, especially when it came to coaxing her through her personal fears. So she turned her imagination on her teammates, being stonewalled again when it came to Sasuke-kun. If Sasuke-kun was afraid, she doubted he would ever admit it. And he'd probably find some way to push it to the side and perform perfectly regardless. That left only Naruto. But while she had a good idea what Naruto might do, she didn't know if she could scrape together enough courage to do it. Or if it was even a good idea. Because Naruto would find the tallest tree around and pitch himself from the top, consequences and fears be damned. But if she could make it and do it without getting hurt, anything else on this island would be a shorter jump. And compared to the trees at home, there was nothing that grew here that was overwhelmingly tall. Somewhere deep in the recesses of her memory, she could vaguely remember lectures about overcoming fear by confronting it directly, even though she didn't know if it should be applied to flinging herself from high places. Even though a part of her knew it was stupid, she dragged herself to her feet and forced herself forward, trepidation growing with each step. But pride pushed against the desire for the fear to just be over, and almost before she knew what she was doing, she scaled a likely-looking tree and balanced herself on the very tip, having learned during their branch leaping session how to infuse chakra into surfaces that wouldn't normally support her weight. And before sense could catch up, she jumped. Sakura choked on her scream on the way down, branches rushing by slapping at her exposed arms, but she was too concerned with the ground rushing up to meet her feet. Bad idea was the loudest fragment of thought rushing through her mind, but it was whipped away quicker than the limbs. Instead, everything became about chakra. In those long, painful seconds, she'd never been so sharply aware of it. Not the ease with which it could flow and ebb, shift and change, nor the sheer possibility inherent in it. It should seem impossible that this thing inside her could break mountains, conjure fire, shape the very air, but if it couldn't, she was about to get a very visceral definition of the term comminuted fracture, which was another broken fragment of thought that rocketed around in her head. Her heart seemed to be falling at a different rate than the rest of her, as it seemed lodged in her throat, and her breakfast was struggling to shove its way past it. But as long as the fall felt, it was over quickly, her trembling fingers touching softly against the prickly blanket of pine needles that blanketed the forest floor. She'd been crouching lightly, dispersing the force of impact through her body just as Kakashi-sensei had shown her, but she toppled forward onto her knees and breathed in great, gasping breaths. Kakashi-sensei landed next to her without even disturbing the pine needles at his feet. "Ah, Sakura-chan?" She managed to utter a somewhat strangled noise of acknowledgement. There was a long pause, as if Kakashi-sensei couldn't decide quite what to say to her. "Did you have a nice fall?" That was terrible, Kakashi-sensei," she gasped. Ma, he said. "You landed safely. But what were you trying to do?" She made a stumbling explanation, which had Kakashi-sensei staring skeptically down at her. "And did it work?" "No," she said very firmly. "Then maybe." That earned her a head pat, which was beginning to make her feel like a favorite pet rather than a favored student. It hadn't escaped her that Kakashi-sensei only did it to her habitually. "Want to try it again?" he asked. When she'd gotten falling down to an art that no longer fazed her, which took her the better part of a week and left her with just enough restlessness near the end to earn her the Megan, Kokoni Araizu no Jutsu, which Kakashi-sensei had introduced rather unimpressively as the weakest of the environment genjutsu, they moved on to something else. Running. But nothing so passé as assigning her laps. This morning found them on the veranda, the faint light of morning just enough for her to read the topographical map he'd weighted with stones, that curious bag back at his side again. "So," Kakashi-sensei said, tapping one of the smooth stones idly against the map, "rules. No climbing trees, no weapons, you'll need water walking, so that's allowed. No forfeit accepted. Your task is to get from here," he said, pointing to where Tezuna's house was, to another point not quite all the way across the cluster of islets, but close to here. "That's it?" Sakura asked quizzically as she tried to memorize the map. "Do I have a time limit?" "Not a time limit as such, but—" Kakashi-sensei's voice trailed off. "Well, I guess you might call it incentive to give it your best, any?" He wasn't looking at her, but his tone of voice had shifted dangerously and Sakura had to fight off a shiver. "Here, go stand across the yard. Wait until I give you the signal." Now wary, her heart thumping just that little bit quicker in her chest, Sakura did as she was told. The peaceful atmosphere had vanished, replaced instead by that kind of ominous stillness right before a storm breaks. There was no particular reason why she should feel like something terrible was about to happen, but already her palms felt sweaty and her breathing was uneven. Kakashi-sensei bit his thumb, hands shifting through hand signs so quickly none of them registered, but when he slapped his hand down against the wood, she couldn't fail to miss the 3 dogs that remained when the smoke cleared. "After 5 minutes," he said calmly, as if there wasn't an enormous bulldog glowering at her from just behind his shoulder, "I'll send Shiba, Urishi, and Bull after you. And Sakura? They do bite. Now go." She bolted. Chapter 9: Cynophobia. For all that farm crops wouldn't grow, there was enough undergrowth along the edge of Tezuna's yard to set her shins to stinging as she bolted into the trees. Sakura had no particular fear of dogs, nor did she think that Kakashi-sensei would intentionally hurt her outside of training. But none of that seemed relevant beneath the sudden, crushing tide of fear. It left no room for thoughts like why, and barely enough space for her to remember she had somewhere she was running to, her mind dominated by what she was running from. Every tall weed lashing at her leg became the first press of teeth, every breeze that rustled branches the noise of pursuit. She'd gone a half-dozen yards before she even gathered herself enough to correct her heading. She ran like she'd run on the bridge, like she'd run on the deck, without regard to how mottled her skin might get or how much she might sweat or how she looked. She just ran. While that might have been for the better, some of the things that her instructors at the academy had tried fruitlessly to drill into them until they were automatic were lost as well. Her posture was loose and sloppy, her pace without concern for stamina, and because of the discomfort caused by breathing through her still tender nose, she was soon gasping air desperately through her mouth. When they'd done sprints in the academy, she'd had a pretty good sense of timing, of knowing within a fairly close margin how fast she'd gone before the instructor called it. But her sense of time faded, reduced to the heavy thunder of her heartbeat. She couldn't measure how far she'd gone when he loosed the dogs. There was no barking in the distance to warn her. And because they'd reached heavier pine stands, where the underbrush thinned out, there wasn't even the noise of that bulldog's massive body coming through the undergrowth. What she got instead was a hair-raising chorus of snarls that didn't sound nearly far enough away for comfort. She thought she'd already reached the limits of adrenaline-induced speed, but somehow she spurred herself faster, stumbling and half-sliding down a muddy bank as she finally reached the edge of the large main aisle. Her foot caught on one of the exposed mangrove roots in her hurry, and she lurched forward, managing to catch herself before she fell, but the movement pulled at her healing chest wound. It burned, as did her still bruised knees, which she'd had less trouble with when she was strengthening them with chakra during her tree climbing and leaping exercises. That thought somehow penetrated the haze of panic that was clouding her mind, and she sprinted forward with fresh, chakra-enhanced speed. It let her draw further from the dogs, their snarling turning now to open barking. It was not the full-throated baying of hounds, but it was close enough to keep sprinting forward with all her might despite the growing stitch in her side. She was running faster than she ever had before, and even if the terrain had been familiar, the speed at which she was moving would have made some things harder to track regardless. Leafy branches seemed to whip out of nowhere, and she caught a face full of spiderweb, resident intact. It seemed to burn, and she clawed at it, trying to get it off, and her shoulder caught the trunk of a tree. The force of it whirled her around, her shoulder aching, but she managed to both crush her passenger and get herself turned back around without falling. It cost her. Sakura lost all the space she'd gained between herself and the dogs, one of the smaller ones darting forward, teeth just missing the hem of her dress, her heel nearly clocking him in the jaw as she pushed her body back into motion. She used chakra and she was slowly getting better at it, only almost pitching herself into another tree before she was running again. Her perception of the world had tightened until it contained only trees and land and dogs and a destination that always seemed so far away. But some part of her recognized if she kept going, kept running, she would reach it. That spurred her across several more uninhabited islets even though her throat was beginning to really hurt and her side was cramping up. But as they grew smaller and some part of her began to think, I can do this. A line of kunai rocketed into the dirt near her feet. They were so close that they kicked debris into her open-toed sandals. Sakura was run almost ragged by this point. She hadn't thought she'd have the energy to be frightened any further, but she was proven wrong as she stumbled backward, landing hard on her butt. Her eyes automatically darted up along the path of their flight, where she caught the briefest flash of movement. Before she could decide whether it was Kakashi-sensei or not, she caught sight of another kunai. She barely managed to jerk her arm out of the way before it could be pinned to the ground. Somehow she got herself up and moving again, but now, rather than carving as straight a line as the growth would allow her, she found herself playing a treacherous kind of game that had her ducking around trees and dodging awkwardly. She couldn't just run anymore, the kunai and the fear of being struck by them forcing her to keep a wary eye above, where she could just catch flashes of movement before more kunai were sent flying her way. Her stamina was flagging badly, and she was almost stumbling forward rather than running by the time she reached her target point. As she came to a stop at the crest of the tiny islet, the first thing she did was double over and empty her stomach of everything she'd eaten for breakfast, and most of what she'd had for dinner. She had somehow gotten filthy, she hurt everywhere, and there was sweat dripping into her eyes and off the tip of her nose. She didn't even have enough energy to glare at Kakashi-sensei when he arrived looking distinctly unruffled, just enough to shamble away from the mess she'd made and then sort of collapse to the ground. Ah, Sakura, you'll cramp up like that. You might want to walk around a little to cool down. As it turned out, she did have the energy to glare, even as she struggled back to her feet, but she wasn't alone in her discontent. His Niken were regarding him grumpily as well. This was just mean, Kakashi, the tan one said from where he sat. Aha, the gray-furred one with the mohawk agreed. Chasing genin is not cool at all, bossman. The giant bulldog made a wuffling sound that Sakura interpreted as agreement. Now everyone, Kakashi-sensei scolded them, eye crinkling smile in place. You make it sound like there wasn't a point to this exercise. Sakura was still wheezing, so she demanded, and? By the weight of her stare. Kakashi-sensei fished a stopwatch from his pocket. You beat your best run time in the academy quite handily. I needed a baseline with you giving it your all, so… Couldn't you have just told me? I could have, he acknowledged, but I wanted you to show me something not even you thought you could do. We're going to work until you can do at least this much without ever breaking a sweat. Sakura's stare was incredulous now. You, she broke off and shook her head. You threw kunai at me, she accused. Not kunai. Just pine cones, Kakashi-sensei said, smile deepening. That's what was in that bag. A practical application of the genjutsu you learned this week. It can make something harmless look like something dangerous. And it can make something dangerous look harmless. But, and his tone shifted more toward lecture mode, it's very weak. If you weren't already panicking, you might have noticed. You have to scene set for that particular genjutsu if you don't want your opponent to realize at an awkward moment what's really happening. If you'd managed to think through your fear and tried a simple kai, you might have managed to break the first genjutsu I used. Very simple emotional manipulation. Also very common. But you'll have plenty of time to think about that. You and my Niken will be working together in the mornings, though I promise it won't be a hair-raising a chase as this morning. Let's see, as incentive. I'll repeal the no muddy paws and no kisses rule for you, Sakura. That earned the attention of his Niken, whose ears perked, tails giving a cautious wag. So you're gonna let us run loose? The gray-furred one demanded. You got it, Kakashi-sensei agreed. Sakura frowned, not at all certain she liked this arrangement, but the fear of the chase was something that ran deep in her now. She'd suffer it if it meant being able to outrun the things that pursued her. Her breathing was easing somewhat, which gave her space to ask, won't summoning your Niken use up a lot of chakra? Because they're summons, right? Kakashi-sensei said as he exchanged the stopwatch for his book, not really, no. At least not in the way you're probably thinking. Most people use summons as the catch-all term. You covered summons contracts in the academy, right? So you know the scrolls are rare and the vast majority are in the possession of major clans. They represent ancient pacts with groups of very powerful creatures that can live dozens of human lifetimes and attain massive size. And their chakra stores aren't anything to scoff at either. The contract isn't necessarily exclusive, just limited by the generosity of the scroll's owner, basically. My Niken are personal summons or contracted animals. I raise them all. The only difference between them and the Inazaka Niken is that I don't typically bring them out in the field with me. They spend a lot of time lounging in my apartment, or playing around in the village, not some other world. They'll live about as long as I will, and while they have plenty of chakra to be good ninja companions, they aren't, say, in the league of any of the summons of the legendary three. Our contract is exclusive and non-transferable. The only chakra I spend is what it takes to get them here. With the right preparation and some cooperation, you could do the same thing to a human. Sakura made a thoughtful noise, risking a closer look at his dogs now that she didn't feel like she was in danger of being torn to shreds by them. But Kakashi-sensei wasn't finished speaking. Your dodging is sloppy, he reported conversationally. You basically throw yourself out of the way, which takes you a lot of energy to recover from. You don't have the stamina for that. And even if you did, there's no point in not correcting bad habits since we're basically starting from scratch regardless. And your form, well, not something I would have given you good marks for in the academy. Even if you're scared to death, you should have done it so often it's automatic. The pack knows what a proper form should look like, so I'm sure they'll give plenty of pointers. The addition of cute, furry animals to her new running regime did not make it particularly more pleasant. Considering that it was conducted just after dawn, and she wasn't allowed breakfast until afterwards, she didn't know what would. None of them were afraid to offer criticism, which was almost harder to take coming from a dog, and they all seemed to think it was particularly fun to tackle her into puddles, rivers, and occasionally trees. Their muddy paw prints stained, their nails scratched, and she found herself the target of wet, sloppy kisses that were gross. It did not make her run as fast as thinking they'd pull her down and eat her, but it pushed her much harder than any of her academy practices ever had. After all, she suddenly had 8 sharp-eyed dogs focused on her training, which made shirking a practical impossibility. Pakin, for all that he was the smallest of the 8, turned out to be the de facto leader in Kakashi-sensei's absence. He was patient, knowledgeable, and not above setting up punishment games that usually turned out in his favor. Tsunami had willingly loaned her the basin that she used to hand-wash clothes in, but Sakura had avoided explaining that she'd underperformed on one of Pakin's training goals and was about to sacrifice her own shampoo and conditioner to give a dog a bath. "I hope human shampoo damages your fur," she thought spitefully as she lathered him up. It hadn't. Pakin had told her sagely that her rough hair was evidence of a bad diet and lack of vital nutrients, and that she should eat more balanced and plentiful meals. When he'd recommended his own supplement plan to her, she'd considered drowning him. Her rewards, such as they were usually in his favor too. Being offered the chance to touch the pad of his paw, which turned out, unfairly enough, to be softer and smoother than her own feet, didn't seem like something the Sakura who'd never seen wave country would have felt was at all equal to the misery of several hours of intensive training. The current Sakura who had just had a vague hope that one day it would be easier. Though she was hardly ever alone, she felt more isolated from her team than ever. Her training started before the others woke, she breakfasted after they left, she barely saw them at shift change, and even in the evenings, when she would have been content to watch Kakashi-sensei coach her teammates after she'd helped Tsunami with the dishes. Kakashi-sensei left her with chakra control exercises that she usually fell asleep in the middle of. But bridge construction continued regardless of her feelings or nagging sense of exhaustion. And one day, when construction was almost finished, Kakashi-sensei dropped in about midway through her morning training session. The Nikin greeted him eagerly and Sakura took the reprieve as a chance to lace her hands behind her head so she could breathe more freely. When Kakashi-sensei had pacified everyone with a perfunctory head pat, he turned to her. His expression was sober and Sakura felt a jolt of alarm, hands falling to her side. He sighed and scratched at the back of his neck. "Your second enemy from the barge. The heavyset one. He died this morning." What do you mean?" Sakura asked, instinctively taking a step back, as if his words were something that she could and should escape. "Head wounds can be tricky. He just never woke up, that's all. He went into cardiac arrest this morning and couldn't be revived. I wanted to tell you now, because it'll be in the report when we return to the village." Sakura stared at him, then her gaze dropped to her feet. Her muddy, aching feet, her toes a tracework of scratches. She tried to focus on that, but tears came regardless. She swiped at them with the back of her hand and told herself that she needed to stop this. It could have as easily been her, lying on that deck. Both of them had made a choice, and he'd paid for his and she for hers. That was all. It didn't stop her from crying, but it kept her from sobbing, which was better than she'd managed before. And unlike Kakashi-sensei, who just stood to one side, the Nikin crowded around her, pressing warm heads against the palms of her hands and generally made a nuisance of themselves as several of them competed to comfort her. Finally, after long minutes, the tears dried up and she could face Kakashi-sensei again. All right, she managed thickly. And the other? Something in her couldn't help but ask. He'll live. Blood loss and a collapsed lung. He's already been transferred to the mainland. Sakura made a noise of acknowledgement. When Kakashi-sensei didn't make any move to leave, she just regarded him quietly, one hand drifting up to clutch at her upper arm. He was scrutinizing her very carefully, which made her uncomfortable. She twisted one sandaled foot against the ground. "The Pax told me you've gotten better at augmenting your movements with chakra. Of course, that doesn't excuse you from the regular kind of training either, because just how much you can augment depends upon what's there to begin with. But you already know that you're much more advanced with your chakra control than most ninja your age. It should be just enough to show you this. Unlike the other two, when I tell you you're not ready to use it in combat, I expect you to respect my judgment. Is that understood?" he asked her gravely. "Yes, Kakashi-sensei," she replied. He nodded, then abruptly, in a movement so fast she didn't even see him move, he was behind her, and all that was left in his place was a cloud of smoke and whirling leaves. "So far as chakra-augmented speed goes," he said as she whirled around, "the Shunsen no Jutsu is the apex of it. Movement so fast that it appears to the normal human eye to be teleportation. Sakura's hands twitched, then clenched as he explained the theory behind it, and the string of hand signs she need to use to help her focus her chakra. She wasn't strengthening any single muscle group, but rather her entire muscular and circulatory system, and not just in the tempered way she'd practiced. Now, just a step or two, Kakashi-sensei cautioned her. To get the feel of it. You won't be able to actually use the shunshin without practice, but this will be movement much faster than you're used to. It took her several attempts for her speed of movement to satisfy Kakashi-sensei, but when it worked, she had a feeling more like displacement than movement, as if she'd left her heart behind when she'd stepped forward. Her hands shook a little as she unlaced her fingers from the hand sign. Part of it was a sudden feeling of increased exhaustion. She'd failed her first attempt simply because she hadn't invested enough chakra in it. Good, Kakashi-sensei praised her. Now, he said, try to use it to follow me. He led her in an incredibly quick start-stop pattern that drained her more with every shift, until she was blindly following him. He'd increased the distance of each flicker until they stood perhaps 10 feet apart. 10 feet didn't seem like such a great distance. Until she was moving far faster than she could see. Kakashi-sensei stepped back and she stepped forward, and suddenly it was only the iron bar of his arm keeping her from a tree. His other hand, index and middle finger held stiffly extended, came to rest at her throat. Now, here's the disclaimer. Your chakra control is very good. But you're not good enough yet to learn to channel chakra to your eyes. They're much more sensitive to chakra disturbance than anything else, so if you're not careful, you'll blind yourself. And if you're moving faster than you can see and understand, an enemy is just going to stand still and let you impale yourself on a kunai. I wanted you to know what you're walking towards, Sakura-chan, but you're not there yet. The bridge was at last complete, their time and wave over. And it would bear Naruto's name. But that was alright. While Tazuna spoke to Naruto and Kakashi-sensei, she was waved over by Masa and a milling knot of other workers. Here, he said, pressing something into her hand, which turned out to be a neatly wrapped package. As she unwrapped it, a new shimok spilled into her hands, this one not nearly as plain as the first, the pattern in a red that was vivid against white. It won't last as long as a bridge, he said with a wry smile, but it'll serve as a reminder that we remember who was there when there wasn't anybody around to hear any speeches. Who kept us alive so that we could build the bridge at all. Sakura's hands tightened on the fabric. Thank you, she managed, more earnest in those two words in this moment than she'd ever been before. Masa grinned more widely and another of the workers, Jiro, she remembered, clapped her on the shoulder. Don't be a stranger, he said, come back when you're old enough and we'll buy you a drink to celebrate properly. Sakura could only nod. And feel that, somehow, all her pain hadn't been for nothing. Chapter 10, Scopophobia, Part 1. She'd left with the ambition of spending time with Sasuke-kun. She was returning with scars and the knives of a dead man and memories of combat, which made her feel like a stranger in her own home. So it was that Sakura was very subdued as they headed to the mission office to be debriefed, even though Naruto was so excited that only Kakashi-sensei's none-too-discreet grip on his collar kept him from rushing ahead and announcing to all and sundry that he was Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage, and they'd already started naming bridges after him. Believe it! Sasuke-kun was just characteristically aloof, but judging by the force he'd put into thrusting his hands in his pockets, it was taking most of his self-control not to smack Naruto. Naruto hadn't really made an effort to rub it in specifically, that he'd come out far the better of his two teammates, but he'd done so much gloating in general and expounded at length about his grand plans for fame and Hokagedom that he'd even earned a rebuke from Kakashi-sensei to tone it down. Sakura's stitches had been removed back in wave, so the scar at the edge of her mouth was plainly visible. It had healed well, considering, and if it hadn't been on her face, she wouldn't have made much of a fuss about the thin pink line. But it felt like a brand, something that everyone could look at, read, and know things about her that she didn't want to share. And well, she was also a preteen girl who'd invested a lot of time and effort into her looks. Even if it didn't have such damaging memories associated with it, she wouldn't have liked to have people staring. So Sakura was overly conscious of the scar, careful to keep her head down, hiding beneath the barrier of her shimok. It at least was something she didn't regret, and she ran her fingers over the edge of it for comfort as they came inside the mission office. The Hokage himself was present again in the general missions room, just as he'd been the day they'd been issued the mission, though that was far from being always the case. Sakura couldn't have said if it bad luck or by design, but she shifted uneasily under the knowing, weighted gaze that swept over them, to land with fond indulgence on Naruto, who hadn't even waited for an acknowledgement to begin regaling everyone present with his version of the story. Her eyes traveled to the right of the Hokage, to find Irika-sensei on duty as well, while the other Chunin sitting to the left was a stranger to her. Her hand came up to clutch at her arm even as Naruto began to embellish his tale with broad gestures and sound effects. Her grip grew tighter as he came to her part, or at least the one that he knew, which made the attention of the Chunin and the Hokage focus on her briefly. She tucked her chin in tighter and glanced away, turned her unmarked cheek toward them. The Hokage must have found his retelling of events amusing, because he let him continue without interruption until it came to the point where he was just re-emphasizing that he was destined for greatness because there was already a bridge bearing his name. "Well, it sounds like you had a very interesting time," the Sandaime said. "I expect that there's a much less exciting version of things in your report, Kakashi?" Kakashi-sensei agreed, unearthing a scroll and a packet from his pouch and handing it over to the Sandaime, who unrolled it in a practiced motion. They stood in relative patience and with varying levels of silence as he read through it, his expression inscrutable. "I see," he said at last. "Well, it was unfortunate that things turned out as they did. And Kakashi, you were perhaps a little remiss in failing to update the village on the mission requiring reclassification. No one worried because you said you might keep your genin out for training, but I think this might have been a little excessive. Even if they sent along enough funds to pay the difference, you might have assumed that I would be a little hesitant in allowing genin to participate in an A-class mission." "Hey, that's not fair, Gramps," Naruto protested. "Weren't you listening? We did just fine." Sarutobi-sama sighed. "Regardless, this village has standards that will be adhered to. All of you will be paid as if this were an A-ranked mission, and that's how it will go on your records. But don't expect that you'll be intentionally assigned any more missions like this until you're a proper rank. Now," and he clasped his hands over Kakashi-sensei's report, "I expect your own reports to be handed in no later than 2 days from now. I imagine you're all looking forward to seeing your beds again, so I won't keep you from it. Though I'm going to borrow a minute of your sensei's time. And Sakura-chan, if you could stay behind as well." Sakura stared at the floor as Naruto glanced over at her curiously. "Why's Sakura-chan gotta stay behind?" he demanded. He was rewarded by Kakashi-sensei's fist coming down on his head somewhat less than gently. "I think that's enough blatant disrespect for today," he said wryly. "Shoo!" Naruto scowled up at Kakashi-sensei but did as he was told, while Sasuke-kun had walked away without a second glance when the Hokage had dismissed them. Both the Chunin were casting sideways glances at the Hokage, obviously wondering the same thing as Naruto but too respectful to outright demand answers. "Sakura-chan, your sensei reports that even though this was your first mission outside the village, during the course of the mission you killed 4 men while defending the bridge builder." Sakura wished that Irika-sensei's surprise wasn't so obvious, the way he jerked his head around to stare at the Hokage before turning back to her, eyes still wide. Even the other Chunin looked a little unnerved. "Yes, sir," she answered quietly. "He also reports that he has already spoken to you about the experience, but I have some knowledge of what Kakashi considers adequately dealing with bothersome things like emotions. We do have counselors available for you, if you need them." Sakura drew in a deep, unsteady breath, but she met the Hokage's gaze squarely. "I understand, sir." She had no intention of seeking them out. Perhaps if they'd returned immediately to the village, back when the nightmares were at their worst, and she was newer to them, she might have. But she could sleep more or less through the night now, even if it worked best when she was weighted down by exhaustion, and she couldn't imagine letting a stranger prod at her personal fears. She was a little surprised when the Hokage rose, the 2 Chunin rising with him. Tucking his hands inside his sleeves, Sarutobi inclined his head, the 2 Chunin bowing more deeply from the waist. "The village thanks you for your service, Harino Sakura," the Hokage told her gravely, the Chunin rising only when he'd finished speaking. though I am sorry that it had to come so early in your career." Sakura could only nod around a knot of complicated emotions, bowing to the Hokage before leaving Kakashi-sensei to face an actual debriefing. She didn't know whether or not he'd be reprimanded for his actions, but for the moment she was only glad she'd only had to revisit Wave in a written report. And that report was already finished, though she'd been too eager in her escape to hand it in. She made her way home instead, using the rooftop paths for the very first time. Once, she thought it would make her feel like a real ninja, but after Wave, it seemed like less of a milestone than it once had. Though it was a strange sort of feeling, to soar above the crowded streets, and see her home from a different point of view. Sakura stopped at her neighbor's home before actually returning to her own. Miwa-san, who'd been her mother's close friend in the academy, and remained so once they graduated, had promised to house sit and collect the mail while Sakura was away. Sakura had long since learned to view her as a kind of aunt, given that she'd looked after her while her parents were away after her baba had passed. She allowed herself to be briefly enveloped in a hug before pulling away and offering an excuse to avoid being invited to dinner. Miwa-san's two young sons, when combined, had about the same amount of tact as Naruto, and Sakura had no desire to answer a lot of questions, not even for a home-cooked meal. She let herself into the empty house with a sigh of relief, shuffling curiously through the mail. When she found a letter from her mother, she ripped it open eagerly, photos spilling out. Sakura laughed at the pictures of her mother posing with hawk chicks small enough to fit in her cupped hands, her habitual serious expression nowhere to be seen. She was grinning widely at the camera, the lines bracketing her mouth less noticeable, making her look years younger. Sakura suddenly missed her mother fiercely, as she hadn't for a long time. Her mother was a career chunin who handled the messenger birds that formed one of the major communication networks both in the village and outside it, so it wasn't as if she lived in fear of a message announcing that her mother had died in combat. But her specialty was breeding and training the fierce, powerful hawks that saw the most use in inter-village and border communications, which meant that most of her time was spent at one of the border stations. It wasn't as if it was a particularly unusual story. Being a shinobi meant being willing to accommodate the needs of the village, and while Haruno Mabuki was occasionally transferred back to the central aviary in the village proper, she shared that rotation with several other ninja just as eager to see their families again. When Sakura had been very young, she'd taken a position that she hadn't enjoyed nearly as much in order to be with her daughter, but once Sakura had been old enough to enroll in the academy, she'd returned to her former position. Sakura had been left primarily in the care of her father's mother, who'd lived with them for as long as she could remember, and after she died there'd been Miwa-san. So it wasn't as if this was something new or unexpected, but there was a strange sense of betrayal lurking in the corners of her mind. Her parents had always carefully made time for the major events in her life, and she was filled with a sense that this shouldn't have been any different. As if, somehow, her mother should have sensed that something was amiss and been waiting for her, ready to. Even Sakura didn't know how to finish that sentence. Make everything alright again, maybe. Not to ask questions, but not to not ask questions. Some impossible thing was what she wanted of her mother. But her mother wasn't here and, judging by the content of her letter, might not be home again until the new year. And even if she didn't have some vague recollection of the details of A-class missions having to be sent using some method other than regular posts, and requiring some sort of permission besides, it wasn't something she wanted to say in writing. "I killed a man today, mother." Not when she finally understood why her parents had been both proud and worried when Kakashi-sensei had been introduced to them as her teacher. She would have settled for her father's reassuring presence, but Haruno Kazashi's jovial, charismatic nature and ability to project an air of harmless civilian served him well in his career in intelligence gathering, which meant that while he didn't have a permanent posting like her mother, he came and went with little notice. He might be home tomorrow, or he might reappear with gifts and a profuse apology months later. Like her mother, he was also a career chunin, his missions running less in the vein of plots to overthrow the daimyo and more in the way of confirming or denying the extramarital habits of wealthy people, which, to hear him tell it, could be more dangerous than you'd expect. But so far at least, he'd always come home safe and sound. But he wasn't here now. So, without parents' arms to throw herself into, Sakura spent the rest of the day catching up on the domestic tasks she usually resented. But somehow, something so utterly everyday as vacuuming seemed to ground her a little. She was in the village, and that meant a certain measure of safety. Not permanent, not absolute, because there would be missions that would take her away from it again, but it was hard to imagine being attacked by anything worse than errant insect life in the halls that had been familiar to her since childhood. She slept easier that night than she had in weeks, even though she found the silence a little unnerving after having shared a room with so many others for so long. She dropped off her remaining cheapao dresses to be cut down and freshly tailored early the next morning, then spent the next several hours finding a perfect, shorter but not too short overskirt to wear over her shorts, as well as tall boots to protect her much-abused shins. Running laps in the academy yard hadn't really prepared her for the reality of running briars, which Paquin insisted built dexterity. Once she saw the price of a good pair, she was glad for the latest addition to her bank account, because she had one last stop even when she'd accomplished all the shopping she meant to do that day. Clutching the paper that contained directions in Kakashi-sensei's surprisingly neat handwriting, Sakura navigated streets slightly more unfamiliar to her. Many of the smaller retailers of shinobi goods and specialized services didn't even allow academy students inside, and with the ongoing Cold War between Ino and herself, there hadn't been much reason to window shop alone. But she finally reached her destination, shifting her packages uncomfortably and reflecting that it might have been wiser to come here first. The storefront, such as it is, wasn't one that would have attracted her attention on its own. For one, there weren't windows with goods on display, just a sign above the door that identified it as being a place of business. And it wasn't a descriptive name either. Just Sakura, almost as plain as one that might have identified a residence. As Sakura cautiously opened the door, a bell jingled, but there was no immediate cry of welcome, which made her very hesitant about going further in. But there was plenty to see, even from where she lingered in front of the door. Lighted glass display cases housed fine leatherwork, while a more prosaic line of sheaths and pouches and complicated harness systems were on display along the walls. It wasn't a very large store, nor did it have much in the way of decoration. Utilitarian seemed to be the guiding principle. She wasn't made to wait very long, as a man emerged from a door in the back of the shop, sweeping aside the unadorned blue Norin. He was about half a head taller than Kakashi-sensei, with a head of disheveled ruddy brown hair, a square jaw with rough stubble on his chin, and a solid build. He was not what she'd expected. "You look lost, kiddo," he observed. "What can I do for you?" His voice was just as rough as he looked. My sensei told me come here and follow your advice," she explained awkwardly. "And who is your sensei?" "Hatake Kakashi." His eyes widened faintly in recognition, then his face settled into less neutral lines. As they were pleased lines, it made him slightly less intimidating. Did more work with his father than Kakashi, but all right. Show me what you've got." Sakura blinked at his directness, before glancing down at her bags and, coming to a quick decision, leaning them against one of the display cases. She kept only one with her. She'd carried it out of the house this morning and kept it close to her all day, as the knives she'd brought with her out of wave were too long to fit in her usual kit. She'd wrapped them in an old towel to keep them from destroying the bag, and as her fingers brushed over the cold metal edges as she freed them, Sakura had to repress a shudder. But then they were swept out of her hand as the man she supposed he must be Sakura-san looked them over. At his clearly dubious look at the discolored one, she said, "Kakashi-sensei said it was probably mostly cosmetic." Not quite certain what to do with the empty bag, she laid it across her other things, and then shuffled them awkwardly as she waited for Sakura-san to finish his inspection. "I assume these hilts were wrapped." "I can replace that, no problem. Nylon cording might be best," he murmured to himself. She nearly jumped back when he crouched suddenly, laying the knives to one side and fishing measuring tape, pad, and pencil from his pocket. "Hold still," he said curtly, and Sakura, used to obeying instructions, did as she was told. "You're displaying better judgment than most with these," he told her as he took measurements with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. "You don't want anything longer than this, not unless you get significantly taller. And I wouldn't recommend anything with more curve." Why?" she asked cautiously. He sat down his tools and took up her knives, flipping them deftly so that they were hilt up, then held them so that they were pressed against the outside of her thighs, something possible only because she'd shed her kunai pouches for the day's shopping trip. The tip of the blade came to just above her knee, while the hilt hit below the widest point of her hips. The thing about knives is that you can't keep them in your hands forever. So you've either got to seal them or sheath them, and the thing about scrolls is that they're a few seconds more work than having them in your hand. Once you get to swords and bigger things, you sometimes get fools convinced that bigger is better, and you end up having to sheath them on your back. And that's bad? As a samurai in armor? Maybe not, depending on how fast you can get that thing off your back, and here's to hoping your opponent waits for you to do it. As a shinobi? Your spine bends. That blade won't. And if you aren't using chakra, it's going to be secured at 2 points, top and bottom. Imagine trying to do a forward roll like that. So you lose a lot of flexibility. Same thing with a horizontal sheath at the waist. You have that overhang, which will catch on things when you least want it to. But these are just about perfect. See how neatly they set flush without overlapping anywhere you need to bend. That's what you want. I can make you a rig for these, no problem. Integrated kunai and shuriken storage too. He quoted her a price that was actually lower than she was expecting, and he must have read her surprise in her features. His hand came down on a knee and he let out a gusty sigh as he shoved himself to his feet. I'm selling you your everyday rig, not the one you'd wear while guarding the daimyo. It's not going to be hand-tooled leather. In fact, it's not going to be any kind of leather. I don't recommend leather for field use, even though I'll make exceptions if you're doing guard duty somewhere where you need to impress some nobles. Leather makes you sweat, for one, and it's hard to maintain for another. If you don't watch, it'll mold and it'll make your blades rust. I use nylon, which is much faster and easier to work, though I'll reinforce where the tip rests and the lip of the sheath. And it's easy for you to clean, too. It will wear out, because you ninja are hell on your equipment regardless on how rugged I make it, so I get a lot of repeat customers. No point in driving them away by charging more than fair price. So you and kiddo? Because if you say yes now, I can have them done in time to test out before the exams. Exams? Sakura asked blankly. Chunin exams, Hasekura-san explained. I figured that'd be the reason Kakashi was sending you here alone, rather than bringing you here in his own damn time. So, yes or no? The answer, of course, was yes. Chapter 11, Scopophobia Part 2. Sakura was in the middle of a dream where she was being slowly suffocated by a remorseless, faceless opponent, when some part of her mind registered that the pressure on her chest was real. That alarmed her enough to drive her up out of sleep, eyes going wide and then narrowing as she squinted into the gray light of early dawn. She didn't have to look very hard. Pakin was right there, his rump planted solidly on her sternum, staring at her expectantly. A very strange sound, somewhere between a noise of surprise and a groan, escaped her. Jek was probably the closest phonetic equivalent. Don't be like that, Sakura, he said. Especially since you got to wake up to this face. This time, it was no mistaking that it was a groan, and Pakin had to scramble over her side as she rolled over onto her belly, laying still for a moment with her face buried in her pillow. The sharp immediacy of the dream was fading. Unlike some of her nightmares, it would probably be almost forgotten by the time she finished washing her face. Giving her best impression of a cat stretching, Sakura managed to escape the last grasping fingers of sleep before she tossed the covers over Pakin and stepped out of bed, where she almost tripped over Guruko, who wagged his tail without lifting his head. How did all of you even get in here? She asked the room at large. She'd suspected yesterday's respite wouldn't last, so she wasn't outright surprised, but she'd thought Kakashi-sensei would give her more warning. We're ninja too, you know, Yurishi answered. If it needs done, we'll find a way to do it. Shiba snickered. Like letting Bossman open the door for us. Akino sighed noisily. Some mysteries are better left unexplained, he said bitingly to Shiba, who immediately maintained that manipulating Hatake Kakashi was a trick worthy of praise. She left them to their low-voiced squabbling, instead running through her much-abbreviated morning routine. Sakura had realized on about day 2 of Kakashi-sensei's walking the dogs training that it was pointless to put much effort into getting dressed the first time, because it was all going to be a ruin after a few hours anyway. although she hadn't submitted to the inevitable until the second week in. But now she washed her face, brushed her teeth, pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail, and made another hazardous trip back across her room to rummage in her closet without even pausing to consider lip gloss or refreshing her nail polish. She'd never thought she would see a time when she was grateful that she wouldn't see Sasuke-kun, but she'd gladly forfeit a good chunk of her mission pay if he never saw her after the Nikken had finished with her. Sakura ended up in cities that she thought might survive the outing, a 3/4 sleeve top paired with charcoal gray capris that tucked neatly into her new boots. Seeing her dressed, her pack of escorts rose, yawning and stretching and complaining, but all their tails were wagging as they herded her toward one of the wooded training areas. Well, except Pakin, who was pretending wounded dignity. Though he unbent enough to inform her gruffly that Kakashi-sensei would meet her at the hospital later that morning, which meant that they'd have to end their session early. His promise that they'd put extra effort into the time they had seemed foreboding. And she was right. By the end of the morning, his wounded dignity had recovered and Sakura had lost almost all of hers. She'd been body-checked hard by Bull during a full-out sprint, which had sent her stumbling sideways, which would have been fine except that Shiba happened to be running there. He'd yelped, she'd tumbled, and in the end Sakura had ended up shoulder-deep in a scummy, mosquito-infested pond. So one of her arms was now smeared with mud all the way up to her elbow where she'd caught herself, and part of her shirt now reeked of eau-de stagnant pond water. She'd worried that she'd hurt Shiba, but aside from an inability to look at her without snickering, he seemed fine. On the other hand, the scar down her chest was itching. She thought it was mostly physiological, having double-checked for remaining wigglers and nymphs among the sludge. She was really beginning to suspect they'd passed that particular pond on purpose, but that didn't stop it from ratcheting from irritating to all-consuming need as she tried to ignore it. When she couldn't take it any longer, she tugged the collar of her shirt away from it, and scratched the section that ran over her collarbone very gingerly with her pinky. It was a much wider scar than the one on her face, rougher and redder, though now it only ached at the end of practice and when it was about to rain. She still turned her head to the side to avoid looking at it directly. That was her only excuse for overlooking the approaching group, because even though her muscles felt like overcooked noodles, she would have had enough energy to make a desperate flight. As it was, she flinched violently when a familiar voice called out loudly, "Sakura, is that you?" Sakura hadn't worn her shimok, because it was still so new that it would be a shame to get it dirty, but she suddenly felt very naked without it as she hastily tugged her collar back into place. But judging by the way Ino was gaping, it was too late for anything but damage control. As her eyes slid away from Ino, she discovered that Shikamaru's brows were raised incrementally, but she couldn't otherwise interpret his expression. And Asuma-sensei was openly surprised. She felt a brief flash of gratitude that Chuji had apparently been determined to finish his bag of chips before reaching the practice field, because he seemed more confused at the reactions of his teammates than anything else. Realizing that she still had her hand clenched over her shoulder, she let it drop to her side. "And who else would I be, pig?" Sakura snapped defensively. She immediately felt a little guilty when Ino bristled, but her embarrassment at having been seen overrode it. It wasn't just the scars, though those were bad enough. She was filthy and she smelled, and her future was full of mornings where she was harried by dogs and missions where she or someone else stood to die. And Ino was pretty even without artifice. She was the Yamanaka on a team tailored to make the best use of her talents, which wouldn't ever leave her stranded on a battlefield. Unfair, Sakura thought spitefully, before guilt made her flinch away from that thought. Whatever they were now, Ino had been her best friend through a very rough portion of her life. And what she'd gone through in Wave wasn't something she would wish on anyone. Her hand had crept up until she was clutching at her upper arm again, lost in her own thoughts, when she realized that Ino was peering at her with concern. She was a lot closer than she had been, probably having stomped closer to give Sakura a piece of her mind. She'd always been like that. "Sakura," Ino said slowly, "those scars." And there was the question she'd braced herself against from the moment she'd recognized the voice as Ino's. She still flinched, regardless. If it had been just the two of them, she might have answered more honestly, But even though Shikamaru and Chuji were Ino's close childhood friends, Sakura only knew them as classmates. Asuma-sensei was as good as a stranger to her. So she shrugged, the show of bravado very brittle, but it was the best she could do. "Sorry," she said curtly, "I have something I need to do." And with that flimsy excuse, she bolted. Sakura had gone home, showered and dressed with a lot more care than she had that morning, and still found herself 20 minutes earlier than Kakashi-sensei. Usually waiting on him wasn't actively annoying, as it gave her time to try and make conversation with Sasuke-kun, but being late to an actual appointment set her nerves on edge. Well, technically they weren't late yet, but Sakura had always been the type to arrive a little early, so that she never looked rushed or frazzled, and because she was the kind of student and daughter that was sensitive to adult approval. Inconveniencing hospital personnel registered to her as a very bad idea, but Kakashi-sensei arrived at the last minute and filled out the necessary paperwork with a nonchalance that made her want to shout at him. But they were in public and he was her teacher, so she didn't. It helped that the nurse was regarding him with a kind of amused, knowing tolerance. But as they were led down a hallway, all her irritation was washed away by nervous anticipation. She fidgeted with her hands as they waited atop the examination table, but luckily, or perhaps as a result of their last-minute appearance, they weren't made to wait long. The woman who slid the door open was average in height, pretty enough in the normal way of things, with long blonde hair pulled back into a low ponytail, but her smile was kind enough to put Sakura at ease. "I'm Honda Koton and I'll be your medic nin today, Sakura-chan," she said as she entered the room. "You can call me by my first name, I don't mind. I hear you had a little bit too much excitement on your last mission." "From what I see here," she glanced down at the clipboard she held in one hand, "it seems like you might be more comfortable if your sensei waited out in reception. Unless you'd prefer he stay?" Sakura shook her head and Kakashi-sensei sent her a little wave as he shambled out the door, book in hand. She supposed he'd be happy enough to sit and read while he waited. She glanced back up at her medic nin, who was regarding the now closed door with the same sort of amusement the nurse had displayed. "That man," she said finally, shaking her head as she turned back to Sakura. "Well," she said, "shall we take a look?" Even if she was a medical professional and a woman besides, there was something a little awkward about taking off her shirt in front of a stranger. It would have been one thing in a public bath, but it was acutely embarrassing to have anyone stare at her when she was taking her clothes off, even if her eyes were clearly fixed on the scar. The woman made a thoughtful noise as she drew closer, setting her clipboard aside as her hand began to glow with green chakra. Sakura was distracted from her embarrassment by the unfamiliar jutsu. They'd been taught in the academy that it was very rare for chakra to have a visible manifestation that wasn't an elemental one. Seeing her interest, the medic nin explained. "This is the most basic and flexible of the medical jutsu. You can use it both as a diagnostic tool, like I'm going to now, or to heal." Sakura tried to sit very still as Koton-sensei ran her hand the length of the scar. She hummed thoughtfully, before saying, "Your doctor didn't do a bad job of it, considering she probably doesn't have a lot of experience with these sorts of injuries. A few sessions and we'll have it good as new." Sakura was surprised when her hand came up to brush across the scar at the corner of her mouth. "Same with this one." Sakura blinked before blurting, "Kakashi-sensei said that the village wouldn't pay to have the one on my face treated. Considering that your sensei is Hatake Kakashi, I don't think he was being intentionally mean," Koton-sensei said as she pulled a wheeled stool up next to the table. "Back when it was still possible to make him sit still long enough to treat him while he's still conscious. And you have no idea how surprised I was that he actually accompanied you in here in the first place. That was the policy." Tsunade-sama's medic program was still in its early years, so there weren't as many medics, and those we did have had to focus on getting shinobi back in the field as soon as possible. There wasn't really the time or excess chakra to spare for cosmetic procedures, but nowadays Konohagakure sees the value in having shinobi that don't look like they eat small children for breakfast. "You might say it's part of our brand," she said with a laugh. "And for kunoichi especially, we feel that there's no such thing as a cosmetic scar. If for some reason you cannot use a transformation jutsu on a mission, people find scarring on men tremendously less suspicious than on a woman. We do try to talk the shinobi into attending the additional healing sessions, But occasionally they decide a particular scar is heroic or manly, and we have to leave it at that. She rolled her eyes, making her opinion of that clear. So, to make a long story short, yes, the village will treat that scar. But while I can take care of this one starting today and have it cleared up in a few sessions, we have a specialist who does facial and burn scarring. Facial skin is especially prone to discoloration after healing, and you'll spend a lot more of your life with it uncovered than anything else, so we turn it over to someone with a really light touch. And while I'll have them make you an appointment, you probably won't get in to see her until after the exams are finished. So you'll have to live with it a little longer, alright? As Sakura had expected to live with it for the rest of her life, it was more than alright. Her scar, already noticeably less red and raised, felt a little strange, but Sakura was in higher spirits than had been usual for her these past weeks as she trailed behind Kakashi-sensei to their normal training ground. The matter with Ino kept threatening to break her mood, but she managed to shove it aside for the moment. But there was something else on her mind, and she took the opportunity to ask Kakashi-sensei about it while they were somewhere where the boys wouldn't hear. Kakashi-sensei? Eh? He asked without glancing over at her. Sakura might have been embarrassed to be seen with someone reading porn in public, or she would have been. If anyone had paid Kakashi-sensei any attention, but she couldn't help but be a little jealous of the awareness that let him read and walk through the busy streets of Konoha without bumping into anything or anyone. The Chunin exams? Are we going to participate in them? She doubted it, as she was under the impression that most genin remained genin for a much longer period of time than they'd been together. But Kakashi-sensei had also allowed them to stay in wave after he'd known about Zabuza. What that said about his expectations for them scared Sakura if she thought about it too much. Kakashi-sensei made a thoughtful humming noise. Sensei is still considering it, so you hold off on discussing it with the boys. There's a little something we need to test first. What? You'll see, was his answer. Sakura battled complicated feelings about the possibility of being entered into the Chunin exams all the way to the Red Bridge that had somehow become the unofficial waiting on Kakashi-sensei location for Team 7. Both the boys looked surprised to see them. Eh? Naruto exclaimed. Kakashi-sensei's kinda on time. What is this? Kakashi-sensei sighed theatrically. Nothing I do ever makes you happy, does it? You sometimes make me wake up really early, and then show up really late, Naruto replied with a scowl. I do I? Kakashi-sensei said, his tone as bland as if it would never occur to him that they'd find it irritating. You do, Naruto confirmed, hands coming up to clutch at the air. I could still be sleeping or at least learning cool jutsu, but no, you just make me wait with this bastard, he said, thrusting both hands towards Sasuke-kun, whose own scowl deepened. Idiot, Sasuke-kun muttered, not quite under his breath. Kakashi-sensei intervened before that could start a whole new round of arguments. Let's all be friendly now. There's something a little different we're going to address in training this afternoon. Naruto tilted his head to one side. You aren't talking about teaching us a new jutsu, are you? He asked skeptically. Not really, no. It's more a teamwork exercise. Do we gotta? Naruto whined. We did just fine before. Yes. Though this is primarily an exercise for Sasuke and Sakura. Sakura brightened at this news, stealing a glance at Sasuke-kun to see what he thought of it. His expression hadn't changed much from earlier, but she comforted herself with the knowledge it was Naruto he was displeased with, not her. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes turned toward her and some of the severity disappeared from his expression. There was never any need for the other members of Team 7 to demand explanations, as Naruto had the market cornered. Why the two of them? He whined and he sounded a little hurt by his exclusion. Sakura was more eager for the chance to work with Sasuke-kun than she was prepared to feel empathy for him, especially as the boys had spent most of their time in wave sparring when they hadn't been coordinating their abilities in actual battles. So far they'd been more a team of two, with Kakashi-sensei and Sakura acting independently. But what Kakashi-sensei said next slaughtered her eagerness. Because at the core of Uchiha-style ninjutsu is the katan. And I doubt he'd be generous enough to learn to fight without it. His words might have been for Naruto, but his single eye was fixed on Sakura. It was the first time she ever wished that Sasuke-kun was somewhere, anywhere else than right beside her. Chapter 12, Ergophobia, Part 1. Sakura stared at Kakashi-sensei, silently begging him to change his mind, but his smile was as relentless as the summer sun. Naruto was darting looks between them, obviously confused, and Sasuke-kun shifted uncomfortably, but her focus was on Kakashi-sensei. I told you that even Jounin don't like using fire, he told her conversationally. But traditionally the Uchiha haven't been among that number. Sasuke's Katon techniques are extremely advanced for his age, and it would be a pity to ask him to give it up, wouldn't you say? Sakura was shaking, both hands snaking up to grasp her upper arms. What's the exercise? She asked in a strangled voice. Sakura-chan? Kakashi-sensei? What the heck is going on? Naruto demanded. But he was ignored. Her fear ratcheted higher as Kakashi-sensei formed familiar hand seals, slow enough for her to follow them easily. At his side, 3 ferocious, sneering shinobi materialized and her throat seized tight, her hands dropping instinctively to her kunai pouch though she knew they were illusory. Sasuke was faster, his hands running through a series of seals so quickly she couldn't follow them, but when they slammed together in the final tiger seal, she knew what was coming. He inhaled deeply, his eyes dark and focused, and when he exhaled, an enormous writhing sun in miniature roared into existence before it spun forward in an inevitable collision course with the enemy nin. She recognized the Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. She also recognized that if the enemy nin were quick, they could have avoided the technique, which was predictable in its path and only as quick in its travel as a well-thrown kunai. But they didn't. Some part of her knew that it was only genjutsu, not even a particularly subtle one, but her memory supplied the stink of it, the sound of it, and she could only watch them burn in mute horror. And the Sasuke-kun in the illusion was not nearly as affected as she was. He looked to her, satisfied as a cat having caught a mouse, and fire gleamed in his dark eyes. She did scream when someone grabbed her arms hard enough to bruise, their nails digging into her skin. "Stop it, Kakashi!" Sasuke demanded, though the strength of his grip had already broken the illusion. "Whatever you're showing her, stop." Kakashi-sensei's voice was even in response, though as Sakura had wrenched herself away from Sasuke-kun and sunk into a crouch, hands clutching at her head as she tried desperately to shove the image away, he could have been shouting and she would have hardly cared. She kept seeing the illusory Sasuke-kun's smirk of triumph, something so familiar from dozens of taijutsu bouts at the academy, so strange and different when partnered with the scene the genjutsu had shown her. "I'm not doing it out of cruelty. There's going to come a point in your career when she's going to have to come to terms with your ninjutsu. Better here and now, without real enemies to take advantage of her distraction, rather than later. Though I have faith in Sakura's ability to work through fear in live combat." Sakura was unmoved by the compliment, because she didn't find much admirable in a determination not to die, nor was she enjoying this particular moment enough to have room for much vanity. "Sakura." She jerked away from Sasuke-kun's reaching hand, taking deep, gasping breaths. "Fine," she said tightly. "I'm fine." A smile was beyond her, but she repeated the mantra once more. "I'm fine." Sasuke-kun frowned at her, but she didn't think he'd contradict her. "No," he said to her surprise. "You're not. But I don't think what Kakashi did helped." "What was the point of that?" he demanded of Kakashi-sensei. "The point is this. After seeing that, how well can the two of you cooperate with each other? How much do you really trust one another? With you and Naruto, you've sparred and argued, but you're still able to work together effectively when it really counts. Are you and Sakura capable of the same thing?" Sasuke-kun looked like he wanted to make a harsh retort, but as he glanced over at Sakura, he subsided. "What do you want us to do?" he asked gruffly instead. "Sakura, you're right-handed, and Sasuke favors his left if given a choice, so let's do this. Hold hands." "What?" Sasuke-kun asked sharply. "Why should we?" "Go on," Kakashi-sensei urged. Sasuke-kun's put-upon sigh was an indication of his surrender, but Sakura felt no giddy excitement as he caught her hand in his own. His own palm was warm and dry, hers clammy. She found it embarrassing, but mostly it was just uncomfortable, as some part of her acknowledged that this should be something she enjoyed, while the rest of her worked to keep from pulling away. Was her attraction to him really so weak as to falter when confronted with an image of him setting people on fire? She'd known he was fire-natured. She'd heard about the Uchiha ninjutsu, seen him use it. But she'd failed to acknowledge what that meant. So the fluttering of her heart when Kakashi-sensei bound their hands together with a strip of dark cloth had everything to do with feeling trapped, rather than titillated. The exercise is simple. Or it would be, if you were working alone or could coordinate your movements well. We've done part of this one before, Sakura. I'm going to give you a destination. The two of you will have to work together to get there without dying. If I get in a clean hit with these, he walked over to the post that he'd once tied Naruto to and hoisted a bag. You're dead and you'll come back here and try again. Die 5 times and you'll fail the exercise. What are these? Sasuke-kun asked suspiciously. This time it's rubber balls coated in red chalk, Kakashi-sensei replied cheerfully. Don't worry. They'll leave some nasty bruises, but they probably won't break anything. Rules, well, I don't have to tell you, no ninjutsu. No weapons. The goal is to dodge, not deflect. Any questions? No? Then, you're aiming for the northeast border of the training ground, where there's a split elm with a pink ribbon tied to one trunk and a blue ribbon tied to the other. When you've got both ribbons, you'll be safe. In theory, it wasn't very different from the exercises she'd run in the mornings on Wave. In practice, it was a different beast entirely. Sakura had several weeks of training in escaping multiple pursuers, in anticipating the points at which Kakashi-sensei would choose to attack, and in tracking a course while in full flight. Her stamina and her ability to dodge was more honed than it had ever been. And Sasuke-kun was, well, Sasuke-kun. It should have been easy. It wasn't. They died twice in quick succession, either time precisely the fault of one or the other, but simply because they were working at odds rather than together. Once while they were still attempting to adjust to running together, even though they were almost the same height, stride length had been less of a problem than Sakura's instinct to settle into the pace she'd learned she could maintain and Sasuke's desire to press them into a slightly faster one, and then because they tried to dodge in different directions, which had resulting in some stumbling that might have been funny if she'd been the one watching. As it was, her shoulder was still a little sore. This isn't working, Sasuke-kun muttered as he pulled them both in behind the shelter of a massive tree. We'll have to call it, or something, whenever we notice Kakashi. Sakura wasn't used to such uncertainty from Sasuke-kun, but she nodded without really looking over at him. She knew she wasn't really helping, keeping more space between than she usually would, but every time she drew close, she thought she smelled smoke. Whether it was real or a product of her overactive imagination, it didn't matter. It was just making the exercise more difficult. So she left Sasuke-kun to lead, but even though he was taking this very seriously now, his Sharingan activated, and Sakura was using her time with Kakashi-sensei to maximize her own usefulness, he wasn't actually trying to kill them, after all. So he almost always broadcast his location in a way they'd notice if they were paying attention. But though they made it farther than any other attempt, Sasuke-kun ended up with another red splotch smeared across his shirt. I'm not deaf, you know, Kakashi-sensei called down dryly from his position in the trees. Sasuke-kun scowled up at him, and they trudged back to the starting point in silence. If it had been before Wave, Sakura had little doubt she probably would have been exhausted by this point. The distance he'd assigned them for their course wasn't insignificant, and, if you compiled their attempts, they'd more than run it once already. But now, she'd only worked past the first wall of discomfort, and she was ready for their next attempt. She finally snuck a glance over at Sasuke-kun, easily reading his frustration, then down at their linked hands. What if? She made herself sidle closer to Sasuke-kun, who immediately noticed the lack of distance, his eyes turning toward her though he didn't move his head. This is just a suggestion, but she said in a low voice, what if we use pressure? HN? What if we shift our hands so our fingers are interlaced? That would be 5 points of contact. What if we assigned a direction to each finger? Like forward for the index finger, back for the pinky, left for the middle finger, right for the ring finger, and down for the thumb? Sasuke-kun was quiet for so long she was beginning to think he disliked the idea and would prefer to pretend they weren't holding hands at all. That might work, he breathed at last. Practice on the way back? And he shifted his hand so that her fingers were laced with hers. Her heart seemed to skip a beat, and it wasn't entirely because the boy she liked was holding her hand in a way that felt much more personal than the passive grip they'd had before. It was also because Uchiha Sasuke, best shinobi of their graduating class, had agreed to her plan. And because that scent wasn't only in her imagination. Sasuke-kun did smell faintly of smoke. She shoved it aside, concentrating instead on cooperating with Sasuke-kun, because it would be embarrassing if she was the one to mistake the directions, given that she'd been the one to assign them. This time, when Kakashi-sensei gave them the signal, they moved off in almost perfect unison. Sasuke-kun seemed a little surprised when she began augmenting her own speed with chakra now that they were on their second-to-last life, matching the pace he'd been trying to set earlier, but he fell in readily enough. And her pressure system worked, their determination making them both hyper-attentive to the signals being sent by the other. It wasn't pretty, nothing like what either of them would have been able to manage on their own, but it was functional. It got them to the elm. And it won them their blue ribbon. But Sakura knew all about last-second ambushes and Kakashi-sensei. The moment she met Sasuke-kun's eyes, bright with triumph and dark as night, she knew what was about to happen. No! He'd already ripped the ribbon free, revealing the paper seal that had been cleverly disguised beneath it. It activated, triggering nearby traps that had been hidden so thoroughly that he hadn't spotted them with his Sharingan. And without it, he didn't have the reaction time to keep from being hit. But Sakura had moved almost before she choked out her abbreviated warning. She chose to ignore that his look of self-satisfaction, of self-assured triumph, was a mirror of the one Kakashi-sensei had shown them in the genjutsu. One day, that might be real. And she would deal with it then, would have to decide whether she'd been more horrified at the act itself or that she'd done it, or if the lingering trauma was caused by some mixture of those factors and other things. But today was not that day. Today, Sasuke-kun was her teammate. Their bound hands made it awkward to do anything but throw herself forward, wrapping her free hand tightly around Sasuke-kun's torso. She used everything she'd learned about chakra manipulation, shoving them away from the tree so quickly the world became streaks of color, one dark splotch that made her tighten her grip almost certainly Kakashi-sensei. She'd thrown them up in an arc that would land her feet first on the other elm trunk, but she was entirely vulnerable in midair. And when her feet smacked solidly down on the other trunk without either of them being bludgeoned, she understood that this was what Kakashi-sensei had wanted. They hadn't won. They were being allowed to pass the test. She snatched up the ribbon regardless, flinging them out of the way of another round of traps. Maybe one improbable day, she'd be good enough to win outright against Kakashi-sensei. But for now, she'd take his approval. Provided, she thought with dismay, seeing how quickly Sasuke-kun was to put her at arm's length, Sasuke-kun was still speaking to her after she'd effectively manhandled him. Sakura had an audience as she stood in front of the mirror, wearing all the pieces of her new outfit together for the first time. She'd made good progress on breaking in her boots, but she'd buffed them back to a dress shine to get the full effect. Her overskirt was shorter and of significantly less fabric than her dress had been, a shade of purple-tinted pink that made the panels look almost like the squared petals of a flower. Her dresses had been cut down into sleeveless vests, and she wore her shimok, which she'd finally become adept at tying. Her hair had been swept back out of the way into a loose, low ponytail, her forehead protector still in its usual place at the top of her head. And, as Sakura-san had promised, her knives sat comfortably flush on the outside of her thighs, with built-in storage for her kunai and shuriken. He'd worked some light padding into the panels that sat against her leg, for long-term wear comfort, and as it was a full rig, he'd explained that it would be easy to add and remove attachments as needed at her belt line. It made her feel very much an adult. Normally that would a very good, empowering kind of thing. But at this moment, in these circumstances, she was uncertain that an adult was something she wanted to be. Tomorrow was the registration deadline for the Chunin exams. Which meant today was Kakashi-sensei's last chance to announce to the boys that they were taking the test, if he'd decided they were ready. Her fingers stretched out, as if to brush against the mirror, but she drew them back before she left fingerprints. "So, what do you think?" she asked her audience, turning to face them. Tails wagged in a kind of quiet applause, though as Guruko's eyes were closed, she didn't know how genuine all of it was. She was struck by a sudden nostalgia for her friendship with Ino. The first time she'd worn her new qipao dress, it had been Ino sitting on her bed, applauding her modeling. She liked the Nikken, strange as that was after what they put her through on a regular basis, but it just wasn't the same. So, with a sigh, she took their compliments as the best she was going to get and let herself and the pack out of the house. They soon wandered off, to do whatever it was they intended to do for the day, and Sakura did the same. Without an appointment to meet up with Team 7 until much later, and with her rivalry with Ino leaving a gaping hole in her time where their friendship had been, Sakura just sort of drifted. She window shopped for a while, but just looking wasn't as much fun on her own, and it was too early to eat, so she was actually sort of grateful when she heard a familiar voice. Though when she discovered Naruto playing ninja with academy students, she didn't know whether that was the proper emotional response. And the implication that she was his girlfriend was entirely uncalled for. She would have let it pass by, because she was a genin now and genin didn't get into fights with academy students. But when Naruto blushed, scratched at the back of his neck, and said, "You think so?" that was entirely too much. Him she could smack upside the head. A sharp glance at the others was enough to send them running, which wasn't a bad thing until the loudest and noisiest of the bunch slammed into someone else. And that someone else was wearing a forehead protector with a symbol she'd only seen in textbooks. He was also very uncharitable about the whole thing, which she could understand, to an extent. Not quite to the extent where it was acceptable to hoist Konohamaru into the air like that, though. Naruto was widening his stance and clearly threatening to escalate the situation with his body language, even if he hadn't said anything beyond his demand the stranger put Konohamaru down. Sakura, however, did not want the situation to become any worse than it already was, especially as she had a good idea why soon a ninja would be allowed to wander the streets freely. Inter-village incidents were bad, regardless of which village it was with. So she bowed instead. "I'm very sorry," she apologized, her sincerity increased by her nervousness. Because while they were probably genin candidates for the exam, both of them were older than Naruto and her. But the older boy wasn't prepared to be appeased so easily. While he was sneering at them, Sakura was searching for the right words to fix the situation, being careful to keep her hands clear of her knives. Because once weapons came into play, or even anything like real violence, it would be very, very difficult to get anyone to willingly back down. Well, at least that was her experience with Naruto and Sasuke-kun. She'd be more than willing to solve things with words. But Sasuke-kun intervened before she could think of anything. And, just as she thought, the stranger was ready to meet Sasuke's rock with something else, though, luckily, she never discovered what it was. As a third stranger, this one a younger redhead, joined the others, she had a moment's doubt whether it was really lucky. Because when he clearly controlled his teammates through fear, she didn't want to know what he'd be like if they met him in the exams. But she bit her lip and didn't interfere as he demanded Sasuke-kun's name and Sasuke-kun received in return the name of Suna no Gara. Let Naruto demand their attention. She would be happy if those intense, unsettling green eyes never fixed on her. No one said a word about her new outfit. Sakura hung back as the boys demanded answers from Kakashi-sensei. And if it was dismay she felt at the affirmative answer, she tried to hide it well. Because, after all they'd gone through together, she didn't want to be the one holding their team back. Naruto would whine, which she'd find irritating but bearable, but after their teamwork exercise and perhaps before that, she couldn't bear to disappoint Sasuke-kun. And he was clearly intent on their participation. So she swallowed down her own reservations. And if she waited until the next morning to fill out the paperwork, choosing instead to spend her evening obsessively checking her equipment, and then spending several hours pressed into the corner of her room, the blanket from her bed draped around her shoulders, as she tried to reason through what tomorrow would bring. There was no one else home to know. By the time she woke up the next morning, she'd regained some composure and perspective. It was only a test, designed to measure their suitability for promotion. Their mission in Wave had been an aberration, one she shouldn't use as a measure for what was actually expected of them at this point in their career. She'd convinced herself that it would be much closer to their academy exercises than the kind of action they'd seen on the bridge. The conditions, after all, would be controlled and the entrance would be monitored, and it wouldn't make much sense to lose genin during the exam. Especially the genin that belonged to foreign villages, like the Sunanin they'd run into yesterday. She could imagine that might become a major point of contention, if it was all that common for their shinobi to die while within the walls of other villages. And upon consideration, when she told her parents about Kakashi-sensei's bell test, they told her stories about their own graduation exams. Her parents were Chunin, and if the exam was really so awful, she thought that would have been the moment for them to mention it. And most of the ninja in the village were Chunin, even those that held non-combat positions. So it had to be something that even those shinobi destined to work in the code-breaking office or in the aviary, like her mother, could pass. So it wasn't confidence that they would necessarily win promotion that accompanied her out the door, but confidence about the nature of the exam. Regardless of what had happened after her graduation, she still remembered what it was like to do well at the academy. If they asked her to do something like that, she had faith enough in her own skills to not be the one who held the team back. And, judging by the expressions and body language of her teammates, both of them shared that opinion. At first, nothing occurred to shake Sakura's certainty. Even if she'd been so unobservant as to miss the fact that the ground floor had been clearly labeled and they hadn't climbed enough flights to make it to the third floor, she'd sensed the use of genjutsu almost before she cleared the stairs. The written exam that followed that bolstered her confidence magnificently, because while she found the questions challenging, they weren't so difficult as to cause her to think she'd gotten any wrong. And if being told that none of that mattered at all, so long as they opted to stay in the exam as so dramatically evidenced by Naruto, tore at her pride, it was nothing to what happened next. The forest of the death was bad enough on its own. But what found them there changed them forever. Chapter 13, Ergophobia, Part 2. Sakura had seen flesh bubble and melt like wax beneath fire before, but she'd never, not even in the wild dreams that followed her first real battle, imagined that someone could just peel it away, like the damaged skin of an orange. It was strangely fascinating, like most truly horrific things were, and she couldn't have looked away even if she hadn't been so acutely aware it was a bad idea. Sakura knew with utmost certainty she'd revisit this scene in nightmares for years to come. It had begun with a wind. She was beginning to suspect that there would come a point in her life where she wouldn't trust any breeze strong enough to raise a cloud of dust or a whirl of leaves without strong evidence that the whole forest was affected, but as this had been a localized event strong enough to raise a path clear of grass and small rocks, she'd been absolutely certain that it was on purpose. At the first strong gust, she'd immediately taken cover. She'd noted Sasuke-kun, stretched belly down in the cover of brush, but she'd felt the sting of Rio-sized rocks and had retreated behind the root of one of the behemoth trees that populated the entire forest. Before they'd been allowed to enter the forest of death, she'd been under the impression that the area was a forested mountain. She'd had no idea that the swell on the horizon was owed not to dirt and rock, but to trees whose branches you could hold an academy drill practice on. So it wasn't so much a root she sheltered behind so much as a thick wooden wall, albeit one with a heavy layer of moss growing on it. It was only when she heard the wind die down that she scurried up the side of her shelter and peeked over, careful to keep close to the tree and minimize her profile. Where they'd been standing only moments ago looked like a blade had sheared a path down the center of the clearing, and she was doubly glad of the protection and vantage the huge moss-covered tree offered. But even from her new height, she couldn't see Naruto. She hadn't thought the wind had been that strong, but the woods were very dense, which was part of what made navigating them so difficult. It was possible he was somewhere close by, her view simply obstructed. If nothing else, she'd learned to respect his durability. He had a fool's luck, and she had to trust that meant that he hadn't been seriously injured. Sakura thought for a moment her belief was confirmed as Naruto came out of the settling dust, but she stayed where she was. They were taught henge in the academy not only because it was a useful jutsu, but also because it was very difficult to detect even by high-level ninja. And she'd lost track of Naruto entirely in the brief chaos. She thought it was Naruto, but she also thought it was suspicious that someone would waste the chakra on such an impressive ninjutsu without attempting to remove at least one of them from the field of battle. Testing for Chunin or not, no one in this forest should have the kind of chakra to use it so frivolously. It could just be an idiot showing off, but she thought there wasn't any harm in letting Sasuke-kun be the one to confront Naruto. If she thought she could circle around behind without being noticed, she might have tried, but she had less than perfect confidence in her abilities. That was in no little part due to certain Ningen, who were either going to give a complex or make her the greatest ninja who ever spent her childhood being literally hounded. So Sakura stayed where she was, muscles tense, while Sasuke called out a challenge. And she was surprised at how quickly Sasuke-kun determined Naruto was a fake, flinging a kunai at him. It was the way he dodged that decided her, not his knowledge of the password. The phrase wasn't long and almost rhymed, and they'd spent a long time honing their memory at the academy, or at least the kunoichi classes had, so she thought Naruto was finally buckling down enough to memorize it seriously. How could he expect to receive and carry messages so confidential they couldn't be written down otherwise? Or even recall complex directions without consulting an incriminating map? She'd had an instant's thought it might have made up, at least a little, for how he made it through the first portion on sheer bravado. Apparently Sasuke didn't share her opinion. And that was a good thing. "You're a clever one," not Naruto drawled. "Why don't you ask your friend to come out from where she's lurking? I wonder if you'd accuse her of the same thing. Are you burdened by dimwits, or is this one just a special case?" "Come on out, Sakura," Sasuke-kun commanded. Sakura did as she was told, sidling closer to Sasuke, who demanded the password from her without ever looking at her. And she, of course, recited it effortlessly back at him. "And that isn't suspicious?" the stranger wearing Naruto's face asked. "No. It'd be suspicious if Sakura couldn't recall the password word for word. Naruto's too much of an idiot to manage it," Sasuke-kun replied, not hiding his disdain for both the stranger and his teammate. In his case, it wasn't so much a password as a trap for anyone who might be eavesdropping. And you stumbled right into it. Sakura wanted to allow this pre-match gloating to lull her into the same sense of fighting for points that she'd enjoyed at the academy, but the dank, heavy atmosphere of the forest and the blatant aggression of the foreign shinobi that they'd shared the waiting room with kept her on edge. As did the thought that they'd all registered in teams of 3, one of theirs was missing, and they had no idea where the stranger's teammates were. Sakura did not want to find herself the victim of being outflanked, whether the stranger was playing for points or blood. All her battles thus far had been won because she'd managed to face every opponent one-on-one. The one time she tried for more, on the deck of Gado's yacht, she'd almost gotten herself killed. So she let Sasuke-kun handle the conversation. "I'm impressed. You haven't dropped your guard at all, have you?" the stranger said, Naruto's image wavering and fading. Sakura was struck first by just how ugly the woman who replaced him was. Her skin was sallow, her eyes had dark bruising beneath them, and her lips were so thin as to be practically non-existent. And she hadn't tried to correct any of it with cosmetics. But worse than that was what she wore. Sakura wouldn't have guessed there was a woman on the planet who'd emphasize an already non-existent waist with a thick rope tied in a strange sort of bow. Combined with the drab, unflattering clothing, if it hadn't been for the feminine mode of speech, Sakura would have guessed man before woman. And an unfashionable one at that. Civilian women could get away with doing what they liked concerning their looks, but kunoichi were trained well before puberty how to flatter and enhance their assets. That was one course she was almost certain the boys had no equivalent for. She couldn't imagine Sasuke-kun sitting through lectures and practical exercises on the production, almost like it was a play, with props and costumes and lines, the markers that differentiated docile housewife from whore and everything in between, of masculinity, as she had femininity. Though, there was no law anywhere that said a man couldn't use feminine speech. And man or woman, it didn't matter. Kunai killed, no matter what hands wielded them. The stranger had been talking as she wrestled with the irrelevant matter of gender, and she'd listened to the words, even if she hadn't been focusing on them. This promises to be very entertaining. Making an elaborate production out of drawing her own scroll out of a pouch, the Kusanine made certain they got a good look at the companion character to their own heaven scroll. You'd love to get your hands on our Earth Scroll, wouldn't you? She taunted, before she did something that almost made Sakura gag. She swallowed it whole. Disgusted, Sakura added at least minor body manipulation to the list of the shinobi's skills. Strange as it was, Sakura wished they'd stop drawing this out. It wasn't like the situation with the Sunanin. There wasn't going to be any apologies and everyone going their own way. This was just scraping her nerves raw, making her so jumpy that it was going to go beyond honing her reflexes and make her clumsy instead. Once, she remembered being good at this kind of psychological warfare. Not as good as Ino, but then again, no one was. It was a dim, faraway memory now. But she didn't have the courage to be the one who struck the first blow, so she stayed quiet, willing to follow Sasuke-kun's lead. And judging by his expression, he was almost as eager to begin the battle as she was, though their reasons were probably very different. That was when the world went wrong. She thought she remembered killing intent. She thought Zabuza was as bad as it could get. She'd been wrong. Sakura had only caught the edge of Zabuza's killing intent. All those times Kakashi-sensei had driven fear into her mind, it was a needle thrusting in this was a wedge driven by a sledgehammer. It tore her open like a rotten stump, exposed all her weaknesses, her insecurities, and ripped her apart with a vivid, immersive vision of her own death. The whole world seemed to be washed in shades of crimson pain. She hadn't realized she'd collapsed to her knees, but she found herself there, trembling violently. It was like those earliest nightmares, where her fear was so great it was a kind of paralysis. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Just sit and shiver, her breathing quick and gasping, the kind that led to fainting. It was Sasuke's violent retching that brought her back to herself. She was always alone in the nightmares. Always. Or as alone as a relentless enemy and encroaching death would ever let her be. The paralysis of terror wasn't the only thing that followed her into waking. More than that came the chase. She'd run and run and run until daylight broke the cycle and even then not escape that restless need. If their enemy had taken a single step forward, had drawn a kunai, she would have bolted. Bolted without a single thought for Sasuke-kun or Naruto or anything else. It was that kind of overwhelming. But as she watched Sasuke-kun struggle to pull himself into an unbalanced half-crouch, she realized she couldn't run, not like that. Because she had never seen this expression on him before, his wild, desperate eyes not focusing on his opponent, but seeking her out. Beyond the crushing pressure of the fear of her own death, something tugged at her heart. Sasuke-kun. What she couldn't know was that Sasuke, in his relentless pursuit of perfection, had created for himself an unexpected weakness. He'd built himself up to never run, and because the fear was too great to advance, he could only stand there and quiver. But she'd been here before. It was not a comfortable place, it was not a pretty one, it was not the one she wanted to live in, but she'd died dozens of deaths in dreams. In fire, in water, in pain that had lasted longer than the brief, harsh death of a kunai driven deep. She was getting a little lightheaded from her breathing, but she didn't slow it. She knew she needed a plan. Needed to do something more than attack or run blindly. But her cleverness was failing her, stymied by a wall of skill. She could not attack and hope to win, but she didn't know if just running would be enough. Not when their opponent could use abilities like this without any sign of preparation or strain. However, whatever this Kusanine was, she wasn't a Chunin exam candidate. Inaction was also death, and between going forward and falling back, she would choose retreat. Choice alone wasn't enough, but unless Sasuke-kun came to himself quickly, it might have to be. She didn't think she could carry Sasuke-kun fast enough to escape, not without something to keep the enemy Nin busy. And she doubted her genjutsu would cause this one to do more than blink. She was drawn from her desperate, fruitless planning by Sasuke's slow struggle to draw a kunai and straighten into something like his usual stance. She'd never seen him fight so hard to achieve so little. Very good, the woman praised him. What happens now? Sakura watched their enemy draw two kunai, holding them tauntingly loose by the loops. Don't worry, I'll make it quick. But I don't have to tell you that, do I? You've seen it with your own eyes. But I must say, how disappointing. Sakura saw the enemy draw her arm back. Saw Sasuke-kun, still held firmly in the grip of his fear. and all her half-formed plans, so painfully reasoned through the press of terror smothering her, vanished. Her hand darted to her kunai pouch, her wrist snapping out in a perfect release while her legs drove her to the side from where she'd crouched, her shoulder coming up beneath Sasuke-kun's ribs hard enough for a pained wheeze to escape. But she dug her fingers into the back of his shirt and straightened enough to fling herself forward into a sprint. So the prey isn't so defenseless, after all, her opponent called after them, the sound of metal against metal telling her she'd parried her kunai. She didn't stop to make conversation, just ran, using chakra and the odd, slanted trunks to take great hurtling leaps. Sakura's back was tense with the anticipation of a kunai thrown in return, but none came. It wasn't luck, she didn't think when she had room to think about anything but angle and output and Kami-sama, what do I do if? But it was part of the same reason that Shinobi had stopped to make conversation before attacking. Whatever she wanted to do it face to face. She didn't retreat too far, part of her aware that Naruto was somewhere, that ninja had done something to him, the other reason being that she couldn't outrun their enemy with Sasuke-kun bouncing against her shoulder like a sack of rice. Sakura expected him to angrily shove away when she crouched down, expected him to assume that extra edge of gruffness that he used to cover his very rare embarrassment, but he just sort of slumped to the ground, eyes still too wide and too wild to even pretend at composure. He was more mobile than he had been, the pain of her bony shoulder jabbing him in the ribs may be enough to loose the hold of the genjutsu, but he wasn't free of it. Probably because it wasn't entirely a genjutsu, Sakura thought as she hovered worriedly. Their opponent was simply that terrifying. Sasuke, he slapped a hand against her mouth before she could say anything more, his grasp on his kunai tightening. We have to get out of here, he whispered desperately. We have to move. That was what he said, but he didn't rise to lead the way as he always had before. She caught a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, and she felt her own eyes widen as she took in the sheer scope of the creature staring unblinking back at her with silent menace. She'd been in survival class mode since they passed beneath the first branches of the forest of death, so her mind provided information without conscious effort. So beyond the immediate, "Oh Kami-sama, that's a giant snake," there was a stream of information. They lived in a forested, temperate climate. Snakes were a fact of her life and Sakura hadn't thought she'd had any particular fear of them. But then again, she'd never met one whose head was almost as large as her bedroom. As she ducked away from Sasuke-kun's hand, she registered non-native, judging by the shape of the head, non-venomous, likely constrictor type, but that was all she had time for as she leapt and the snake struck at her with blinding speed. Its teeth were matched rows of backwards curved white pillars that led down into the darkness of its throat, 2 rows on the lower jaw, and 4 along the roof of its mouth. And as that mouth closed around her, the thought that she'd guessed correctly about it being a constrictor wasn't any kind of comfort. But she didn't have time for self-congratulation or regret. She'd drawn kunai as she jumped from the tree and now she used them to anchor herself against the forward momentum that would have had her in the back of its throat. She drove them deep into the roof of its mouth, swinging her feet up so that she could latch onto the ridged ceiling with chakra, which worked for the moment before it registered the pain, and then she was a rock being shaken in a wooden box, except this box had nails driven in it with the pointed ends exposed, and the rock was flimsy and fleshy. It was whipping its head about violently, trying to dislodge her, its size actually a hindrance because she was too small to be forced down its maw by the powerful muscles in its throat. She tried to hold herself in place, but while her arms and legs were safely away from teeth, she wasn't strong enough to hold her core completely steady. Her shirt caught on the tip of one and in her distraction, the next sudden shift saw more than fabric caught. She swallowed a shriek and stifled the instant urge to rip away, closing her eyes so that she could pretend she wasn't in something's mouth, and waited for the right moment. It came when the snake threw back its head, nearly 2/3 of its massive body rocketing upward, perfectly perpendicular to the ground. Sakura let go and for a moment she was in terrifying freefall, her back to the waiting throat and with no good way to judge distance in the dark, but for just a moment the jaws opened, sunlight spilled in, and she drove in a second set of kunai. This time she was far enough back that she only need to worry about the teeth if the snake dropped its head and she fell forward, but she'd had enough of this. It wasn't nearly as damp as she would have thought, but there was an unnerving smell and her side was warm and sticky and aching. She shoved off from the roof and landed awkwardly across the presently vertical space at the base of the mouth, just at the back of the tongue. She'd lost her footing and had to channel chakra through her hip instead, but she was sprawled next to her target area and that would have to be good enough. Sakura had tried to remember if she'd been taught anything of snake anatomy, but all she could remember at the moment were irrelevant facts about organ size increase during digestion, and it wouldn't help at all if its heart could expand up to 40% with a large meal. But the brain was protected by bone, the spine by flesh and distance, so that left the front of the throat. This time, she unsheathed one of her knives, longer and better suited for cutting than any kunai. She flipped it so that the curve was angled as if she had a fawn of her own, and with all her weight and chakra, both hands firm on the hilt, she plunged it down, and then tore them through the flesh like she was trying to plow a field. Blood spurted up, soaking her hands, her front, her face, but she only redug the trench, the unprotected flesh parting gratifyingly beneath her well-sharpened blade. She worked with frantic energy, and because she was no longer dangling, its struggling became less painful and more simply the sensation she'd left her stomach some 20 feet behind. Then she saw daylight and she followed it, using her knife and her free hand to part the way, slithering free of the writhing mass of snake like some particularly monstrous birth. She hoped it was residual nerve function, but even it wasn't. Animals weren't like humans. In the face of devastating injury, they would back down and flee. Standing unsteadily, she was surprised to glimpse Sasuke-kun. Her sense of time and distance, constrained by the dark interior of a snake's mouth, had made the brief struggle last much longer and cover much more distance than it had. Her breathing settling a little from its ragged pace, she leaped back up the trunk to rejoin him, and it wasn't until she went to sweep her bangs away from where they were sticking to her cheeks that she fully realized just how covered in gore she was, her knife still clenched in one hand in a white-knuckled grip. So it was that she thought Sasuke-kun's look was for her, but when he gritted out, behind, she turned to see something bubbling up out of the snake's head. Their fight wasn't nearly finished yet. Chapter 14, Ergophobia, Part 3. Like some sort of terrible warble, the snake's skin swelled and parted to reveal the Kusanine, who didn't look at all upset at the turn of events. Sakura couldn't say the same, because she'd really hoped that the enormous snake, while she hadn't recognized it as a native species, had simply happened to live in these behemoth, oversized trees. That it hadn't been a summoned animal. Because that meant they had no chance at all. Though she'd been sweaty and warm from her struggle inside the snake, Sakura felt a chill sweep through her. I don't want to die. Not for a Chunin exam, not at the hands of this Kusanine, not before she had her first kiss, went on her first date, or any of the 100 other things normal, stupid things she was supposed to be able to do before she died. Her grip on her knife was so tight that her fingers tingled from lack of circulation, and she eased her grip a little. No ninja lived forever, but she thought she would die for a better reason than this strange encounter. The Kusanine had never even made clear what it was she wanted, and she certainly hadn't thought she'd die in one of Konohagaku's practice fields. Where were the proctors who were supposed to be monitoring this exam? She thought with a deep sense of abandonment and betrayal. How can she just summon something like that here and no one sense a thing? Surely they could have enlisted the Hyuga clan to help keep track of the candidates in the forest, if for no other reason than to make certain that the foreign nin didn't leave the zone and attempt to infiltrate the village proper. This was the bridge all over again. Even Sasuke-kun, as he was now, provided her with no feeling of reassurance that everything was all right, that things would be taken care of as they should be. At least Sasuke-kun didn't look as stiff as he had earlier. He didn't look normal by any stretch of the imagination, but she thought she could trust that he would at least move if the Kusanine attacked. I sense your fear and desperation, the woman below them crooned. The prey must never let down its guard, not even for a moment, in the presence of its predator. Although your friend's little fangs are unexpectedly sharp, mine are sharper. And then she was coming towards them, and Sakura upgraded minor body manipulation to major body manipulation, because she slithered up toward them fast and agile as a real snake, her whole body flexing to conform to the shape of the tree. Sakura crouched, shifting her grip on her knife and leaving her other hand free for now, trying for some flash of inspiration that would allow her to use the environment against her opponent. None came, but Naruto did. Sakura was just a little bit relieved, but Sasuke-kun obviously felt that he was just one more person coming to die. And when the Kusanin agreed, that was enough to set Naruto off. "You've been picking on my friends and I don't like that," he declared, as if they were six and on academy grounds rather than standing over the cooling corpse of one of the largest summoned animals Sakura had ever even heard of. "Slither on back into your hole, snake lady." Sakura hadn't even noticed that Sasuke-kun's Sharingan was activated until his eyes faded to black. Reaching into his pouch, he withdrew their scroll, turning it so that the heaven character was clearly displayed. "Here," he offered, his voice steady and determined, "you can have it." "Say what?" Naruto shouted indignantly. "No way, we're just going to hand the scroll over to the enemy. What's wrong with you?" "Stay out of it." Sasuke-kun snarled at Naruto without so much as glancing at him. "Very wise, very sensible," the Kusanin said, reaching out a hand as Sasuke-kun threw the scroll in a lazy arc. An arc that was intercepted by Naruto, who shoved the scroll forcefully into his own pouch and turned to glare at Sasuke-kun. He turned his back on the Kusanin as he stalked toward them on the branch. "Stop playing the damn hero," Sasuke-kun growled, "just stay out of it and leave it to me." Naruto's response to that was to punch him full in the face and Sasuke-kun stumbled back. "You idiot," Sasuke-kun hissed, "you don't know what you're doing." Naruto was breathing heavily, from emotion rather than exhaustion, and he yelled back, "I may not know the password, but I know who I am. You're the one I'm not so sure about." "How do we know you're who you say you are?" "Surrendering, giving up the scroll. When did Sasuke become a coward?" "You keep saying I don't understand what's going on, but I do. You've choked, that's what it is." Sakura had never wanted to hit Naruto so much in her life. If she smacked him atop the head now, he'd go face first down against the tree and he'd do it so hard he'd bounce. She was that mad. She could have shook him until his teeth rattled, because did he think that sheer determination was all it took? If that was it, no one would ever die. She was so angry that she wanted to let him face the snake alone when the Kusanin summoned another one, because he'd created an impossible situation. If he refused to retreat, unless they abandoned him, none of them were going to escape. "Kakashi-sensei, there should be a subclause that exempts us from being trash when it involves idiots who are going to get all of us killed. Get a clue, Naruto!" She barked as she dashed past him, his eyes widening incrementally as he took in her appearance. "This exam isn't worth dying for. I won't die for your pride or a stupid scroll or so that you can be the big damn hero. Whether she looks like an Okama or not, she's not someone you can beat just by getting up again when you're knocked down." This time there was still branch beneath her, as she came upon the snake, and she dodged just enough to the side that the wind of its passing raised the fine hairs on her arm. As the tip of its head came even with her to her left, she flipped her knife into her left hand with the open edge of the curve toward her back, set her right hand against the hilt, and drove it in as deep as she could, the knife scraping against the bone of its skull, the curve of the blade keeping it from catching or breaking. Her forward momentum and the snake's conspired to open a deep, gaping wound that trailed from its nostrils to the point where it slipped from the branch to fall down, down, down to the forest floor far beneath them. She was so angry, so she trembling as she turned to face their opponent once again. "That wasn't a very nice thing to say," the woman chided her. "Implying that I'm not very pretty isn't any way to make friends." But Sakura was done talking. She'd put the woman between herself and her teammates, which would have meant something with another enemy, but now her desperate lunge forward was made only with a hope to rejoin the others, yank Naruto away by his collar if necessary, and get as far from this woman as her skills would take her. Without any evidence that this was difficult, that these enormous snakes cost her any more effort than a thrown kunai, she summoned another one and Sakura was forced to leap aside or be crushed under the weight of its manifestation. Before she could make it back up to the branch, it struck at the boys and it was Naruto who stopped it. Her gratitude fell flat when he just taunted Sasuke-kun, calling him a scaredy cat in reflection of Sasuke-kun's earlier insult to him. Part of her went serves him right when the woman dismissed the summon, and her tongue darted out quicker than the snake itself had moved, drawing Naruto back to her. She didn't see what sort of jutsu she used on Naruto, but she clearly saw the moment when she lifted him up as if he weighed nothing and tossed him aside. When he bounced off the tree's bark limply and began to fall, her hand darted to her kunai pouch and her throw drove it deep through his loose jacket and into the tree. A shudder made its way down her spine as the Kusanine glanced down at her. "You're proving to be quite the vexing little prey, aren't you? There you are, all trembling, but you're the only one covered in the blood of your slain enemies. How very interesting." "Sasuke-kun!" she shouted up at her teammate, ignoring the clear ploy to draw her into another conversation. She meant it as encouragement to take up his original plan. He was closer to Naruto and stronger than she was. He could have taken the opportunity to throw Naruto over his shoulder, toss the woman the scroll retrieved from Naruto's kit, and attempt to make a clean escape. He took it as something else, jerking to awareness of himself like he'd been slapped, and the battle that followed was conducted at speeds she almost couldn't follow with her eyes. But she did see the moment when the Kusanine dodged Sasuke-kun's kunai by shifting her head only an incremental fraction, and she understood, this is why Kakashi-sensei called my dodging sloppy. It moved so quickly over so much territory that she caught up to them only at the end of it, when they'd looped back around almost to where they'd begun, and he had the woman bound to a tree. She suspected what would come next before he used the Katon, Ryuka no Jutsu. His aim, her mind registered dimly, was off, the fire searing a hole through the tree trunk just above and to the right of the enemy nin. And she only screamed the once, shrill and high and cut short quickly. It was, she thought as she drew nearly abreast with Sasuke-kun, somehow, too clean, almost. Because it wasn't natural fire, it hadn't scorched the bark much outside the target zone, but none of the woman's clothes had caught fire, and while her skin on her forehead had drooped and melted, it wasn't blackened or burnt. "Get back," she snapped, reaching forward instinctively to snatch at Sasuke-kun's collar, but the woman was quicker. Sasuke-kun had let the wire go slack, so there was nothing to stop her hands from running through seals, her whole neck elongating as she struck out at Sasuke-kun, burying her teeth deep into his neck. Sakura turned her grab into a strike, but the woman pulled away with a satisfied smirk. Sasuke-kun collapsed to his knees, clutching at his neck, which wasn't bleeding freely like it should have been. His small, half-smothered noises of pain tugged at her more than screaming might have, and she crouched beside him helplessly, her eyes still fixed on their enemy. The melted mess of face had obscured one eye, and the woman reached up and tore the sagging flesh away, revealing much paler skin beneath. A striking eye, unnervingly intelligent and amused, its piercing gold skillfully emphasized with deep purple. Caught by that gaze, she almost didn't notice that the symbol he wore had changed from that of Kusugakure to the single note that she'd only seen once before. "What did you do to Sasuke-kun?" she demanded. The voice that answered her was far lower and somehow more menacing for the fact that he, and it was certainly a he, retained that playful edge. "I just gave him a little parting gift. I think you'll find it very useful when it comes time to face my team. I'm sure he'll like it. Very soon, I think Sasuke will seek me out. He'll desire my power." He tilted his head, as if in consideration. "I wonder if you would tell me why you didn't think I was dead, when Sasuke so clearly thought so and was relieved for it." "It's not my first time setting people on fire," Sakura answered in a low voice. She was further unnerved to see that answer made him smile. "Ah, I'll keep that in mind. I wouldn't linger here, if I were you. I told my team to pay you a visit, and it's a bad place to receive guests." And then he was gone, and Sasuke-kun was all but whimpering next to her, so she tucked her knife away and knelt properly beside him, reaching forward with the intention of checking his wound. She didn't expect him to collapse into her, still making those pitiful noises, his skin so hot she could feel it even through the barrier of her clothes. Though the timing was completely inappropriate, her heart seized, especially when her hands came up automatically to draw him closer to her. Her hand cradled the back of his head and found his hair so very fine and downy soft, and as his body sprawled across her lap, his head was pressed against her sternum. It was a strange, powerfully mixed feeling, partly very maternal, like she was cradling a hurting child to her chest, partly that of a girl very close to the object of her desire. It was his scent that anchored her, because beneath that smoky smell that always lingered, he smelled like sweat and fear. She glanced helplessly behind her, but Naruto remained pinned to the tree where she'd left him, his jacket still holding for the moment. Sakura was alone again.